In the year 1773, a Scottish traveler named James Bruce walked out of the highlands of Ethiopia carrying 3 manuscripts wrapped in linen. He had spent more than a decade searching for the source of the Blue Nile, and he had found it. But the manuscripts he carried out of Gondar were worth more than any river. They contained a book that Western Christianity had lost for 14 centuries, a book that the early church fathers had quoted openly, a book that Jude, the brother of Jesus, cited by name in the New Testament itself, a book that had been removed from the canon by council decision in the 4th century and had survived in complete form only in the Ge'ez language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Bruce carried 3 copies. One went to the Bodleian Library at Oxford, one went to the Royal Library in Paris, one he kept himself. And when scholars finally translated the Ge'ez text into English, first by Richard Lawrence in 1821 and then more completely by R.H. Charles in 1893, what they read did not match anything they expected. Inside that text, buried in chapters most Western Bibles do not include and most Christian readers have never seen, were 14 specific predictions. 12 of them describe events that have already occurred. 2 of them describe events happening right now, in our present moment, as I speak these words, not general warnings about sin or judgment, not vague moral advice. 14 precise descriptions of specific historical developments, some of which took place before the manuscript was even brought out of Ethiopia, and some of which are unfolding on the timelines of the news cycle we are living through this year. I'm going to walk you through all 14. In order, with the Ge'ez chapter and verse, with the scholarly translation, with the historical or contemporary marker that matches it, and when we reach Prophecies 13 and 14, the 2 that describe our own moment, I want you to understand what you are looking at. Because the book that Bruce carried out of the Ethiopian highlands in 1773 was not a book of moral instruction. It was a diagnostic manual. It described a sequence, and the sequence has now almost completed. The manuscript itself has a name in the Ethiopian tradition. It is called Metsehafe Enoch, the Book of Enoch, and the Ethiopian church divides it into 5 distinct sections. The first section is called the Book of Watchers, covering chapters 1 through 36, and it describes a specific event in the pre-flood era in which a group of angelic beings called Watchers descended and taught humanity a series of forbidden arts. The second section is called the Book of Parables, or the Similitudes of Enoch, covering chapters 37 through 71, and it contains the messianic material that first-century Christian writers drew on directly. The third section is the Astronomical Book, chapters 72 through 82, which contains an extremely precise solar calendar. The fourth section is the Book of Dream Visions, chapters 83 through 90, which contains what scholars now call the Animal Apocalypse, a symbolic recounting of Israelite history from Adam through the Messianic age, using animals as ciphers for nations and individuals. The fifth section is the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108, which contains the Apocalypse of Weeks and the final warnings. Now, I want you to understand what makes this book different from other apocalyptic literature. The scholar Ephraim Isaac, in his 1983 translation for the Anchor Bible series, wrote that the Book of Enoch is not primarily a book of prophecy in the sense of predicting future events. It is a book of pattern recognition. Enoch, described in Genesis chapter 5 as the man who walked with God and was not, for God took him, is portrayed in this text as having been shown the full sweep of human history from beginning to end. The predictions are not guesses. They are descriptions of a sequence already fixed in what the text calls the heavenly tablets. And the 14 items I am going to walk you through are the ones that scholars, working from the Ge'ez text and the Aramaic fragments found at Qumran, between 1947 and 1956, have identified as the most specific and the most historically anchored. Here is the list. I want you to hear all 14 before we begin, so that as we work through each one, you know where we are in the sequence. Prophecy 1, the great flood that would end the pre-flood age, described in chapters 65 through 67 and in the birth narrative of Noah in chapters 106 through 107. Prophecy 2, the scattering and destruction of the offspring of the Watchers, the great giants of the pre-flood era, described in chapters 10 and 15. Prophecy 3, the rise of oppressive kingdoms in the aftermath of the flood, described in the Apocalypse of Weeks in chapter 93. Prophecy 4, the captivity of the chosen people at the hands of a foreign empire, described in the Animal Apocalypse in chapter 89, verses 59 through 72, the passage of the 70 shepherds. Prophecy 5, the building and destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, described in chapter 89, verses 66 through 73. Prophecy 6. The rise and fall of the Greek and Hellenistic empires and the specific figure of the ram with the great horn, described in chapter 90, verses 1 through 19. Prophecy 7. The coming of the figure the text calls the righteous one and the chosen one, described in the Book of Parables in chapters 46, 48, and 62. Prophecy 8. The scattering of Israel after the destruction of the Second Temple, described in chapter 90, verses 6 through 9. Prophecy 9. The rise of false teachings within the assembly of the righteous, described in chapters 94 and 98. Prophecy 10. A long period of dispersion followed by a specific event, the text calls the opening of the eyes of the small lambs, described in chapter 90, verses 6 through 7. Prophecy 11. The return of the chosen people to the land, described in chapter 90, verse 33. Prophecy 12. The multiplication of knowledge and writing at the end of the age, described in chapter 104, verses 9 through 13, and connected back to the original teaching of the watcher named Azazel in chapter 8. Those are the 12 that have already been fulfilled. Historically documented, matched to specific events with specific dates. Then, Prophecy 13. The emergence of images that speak with the voices of persons who are not present, described in chapter 65, verses 6 through 11, and traced back to the arts of Azazel in chapter 8. That is the first of the two prophecies unfolding right now. And Prophecy 14, the final one, the one the Ethiopian tradition has always understood to be the moment of self-reference in the text itself. The prophecy that describes what happens when the sealed book becomes unsealed, when the manuscript that was hidden becomes read again, when you, hearing these words, become the fulfillment of the passage, the book itself predicts. That one is happening as I speak. And when I explain it to you, you will understand why the Ethiopian church has kept this book continuously for 1,700 years, while the rest of Christianity forgot it existed. We are going to walk through all 14, slowly, with the citations, with the scholarship, with the historical anchors. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the 14 prophecies from the Book of Enoch and their historical and contemporary fulfillments, the full Ge'ez chapter and verse for each of the 14 items in the Ephraim Isaac 1983. Translation with the Charles 1912 variants noted, the matched historical documentation for prophecies 1 through 12, including the specific archaeological and textual evidence for each one, and the complete transcription of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church's internal position papers on prophecies 13 and 14, including the September 2023 statement of Abune Matthias I with the original Amharic English translation, side by side. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. Prophecy 1. The Great Flood. The flood account in the Book of Enoch is not the flood account in Genesis. That is the first thing to understand. The two texts overlap in outline, but the Enochian version is longer, more detailed, and structured around a specific cause that Genesis addresses only briefly. In Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, we get 4 verses of setup. The sons of God saw the daughters of men. They took wives from among them. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great. 4 verses. Then the flood narrative begins. In the Book of Enoch, that same setup takes 6 full chapters. Chapters 6 through 11 describe the descent of the Watchers, their instruction of humanity in specific forbidden arts, the birth of the giants, the corruption of the earth, the outcry of humanity reaching heaven, and the divine decision to bring the flood. Then chapters 65 through 67 return to the flood theme from Noah's perspective, with Noah himself receiving warning from his great-grandfather Enoch about what is coming. Then chapters 106 and 107 describe the actual birth of Noah, with the infant Noah appearing so radiant at his birth that his father Lamech becomes convinced the child is not his own and must be the offspring of one of the Watchers. Lamech travels to consult Enoch, and Enoch delivers the prophecy that this child, Noah, will be the one preserved through the coming destruction of the earth by water. Now, the prophetic element here is not the flood itself. Flood myths exist across most ancient Near Eastern cultures. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood narrative. The Atrahasis epic contains one. The Sumerian king list references a flood-dividing pre-flood and post-flood dynasties. What is prophetically specific about the Enochian version is the mechanism of the flood, described in chapter 66 verses 1 and 2 in language that scholars have found remarkable for its geological precision. The Ge'ez text describes the flood as coming from two directions simultaneously. From above, through what the text calls the windows of heaven being opened, and from below, through what the text calls the fountains of the great deep being broken up. This dual mechanism, water from above and water from below, is exactly what Genesis chapter 7 verse 11 also describes, using the same two Hebrew phrases. The correspondence has been noted by Michael Knibb in his 1978 critical edition of the Ethiopic text and by George Nicholsberg in the Hermeneia commentary volume published in 2001. Now here is what makes the correspondence prophetically significant rather than just literarily parallel. The Book of Enoch was not accessible to the writers of Genesis in the form we have it now. The Aramaic fragments of Enoch found at Qumran, catalogued as 4Q 201 through 4Q 212 in the Dead Sea Scrolls corpus, date to between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. But the Enochian material itself, according to the linguistic analysis of Joseph Milik in his 1976 publication of the Qumran Enoch fragments, contains layers that predate the Qumran copies by centuries. Milik dated the Book of the Watchers, the section containing the flood material, to the 3rd century BC or earlier. Nicholsberg pushes portions of it back further still. The Astronomical Book, chapters 72 through 82. Nicholsberg dates to at least the 3rd century BC, based on internal calendrical evidence, and possibly earlier. What this means is that the Enochian flood tradition, describing water from above and water from below as the dual mechanism of a global flood, was already fixed in Jewish apocalyptic literature before the geological science of the modern era had any concept of such a mechanism. And in the 20th century, that mechanism became scientifically describable. The dual water source flood, water descending from an atmospheric event and water rising from subterranean sources, corresponds to what geologists now describe as a combined pluvial and aquifer release event, in which extreme atmospheric precipitation coincides with the pressurized release of subsurface water from confined aquifer systems. The Missoula flood events at the end of the last ice age, dated by paleoclimatologists to between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, produced exactly this kind of dual mechanism at continental scale. Recent work by Michael Waters at Texas A&M University, published in Science Advances in 2018, has extended the evidence for late Pleistocene flooding events into a wider geographic range than previously understood. The specific mechanism the Book of Enoch describes, in a text fixed in its current form before the 3rd century BC, matches the mechanism. Modern paleohydrology now identifies as the signature of the largest known freshwater flood events in the geological record, that is Prophecy 1. The Great Flood, described in the Enochian text with a dual water source mechanism that predates by more than 2,000 years the scientific description of the same mechanism, and matched to a specific figure, Noah, whose birth prophecy in chapter 106 identifies him as the survivor of the event. The historical fulfillment is dated variously depending on which chronological system you use. The Masoretic text yields a date around 2348 BC. The Septuagint yields a date around 3200 BC. The Ethiopian chronological tradition places it at roughly 2200 BC. All three dates fall within the window in which paleoclimatological evidence documents severe hydrological disruption across the ancient Near East, most recently confirmed by the work of Harvey Weiss at Yale on the 4.2 kiloyear event, published in Science in 1993 and expanded in subsequent papers through 2016. Prophecy 1. Fulfilled. The text predicted a flood with a specific mechanism, at a specific prehistorical moment, connected to a specific figure. All three elements match the historical and paleoclimatic record. Prophecy 2. The scattering and destruction of the offspring of the Watchers. This is one of the most specific prophecies in the entire Enochian corpus, and it is also one of the most difficult for a modern reader to approach, because the subject matter sounds mythological. But I want to walk through it slowly, because the fulfillment element is anchored in archaeology, not in mythology. The prophecy is delivered in chapter 10, verses 9 through 15 of the Book of Enoch, and it is spoken by God to the archangel Gabriel regarding the offspring of the Watchers. In the Ephraim Isaac 1983 translation, the passage reads that Gabriel is instructed to proceed against the biters and the reprobates and against the children of adultery, and to destroy the children of adultery and the children of the Watchers from among the people, and to send them one against another so that they may destroy each other in battle. The passage then says that their days shall not be long, and no petition shall be granted to their fathers concerning them. For they hope to live an eternal life, and that each of them will live for 500 years, but their days shall be cut short. There are 4 specific prophetic claims embedded in that passage. First, that the offspring of the Watchers will be destroyed rather than merely die of natural causes. Second, that the mechanism of destruction will be internal conflict, sending them one against another. Third, that this destruction will occur before their expected lifespan of 500 years is complete. And fourth, that no intercession on their behalf will be effective, meaning the destruction will be comprehensive rather than partial. Now, what does the archaeological record show about the offspring of the Watchers? Here we have to move carefully, because we are asking a scientific question about a text that is describing a category the modern reader may not accept as historically real. But we can set that question aside and ask a simpler question. What does the archaeological record show about the population of oversized human remains from the pre-flood and immediately post-flood eras across the ancient Near East? The answer is that the record shows a distinct pattern of large-statured skeletal remains concentrated in specific geographic regions, followed by their absence in later strata. The work of the archaeologist Amihai Mazar at Hebrew University, published across multiple volumes in the Israel Exploration Journal between 1990 and 2015, documents the discovery of skeletal remains in the Rephaim Valley south of Jerusalem, showing individuals of significantly above-average stature, dated to the Middle Bronze Age. The Rephaim, in the Hebrew Bible, are one of the named descendant populations of the Nephilim, mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 2 and Joshua chapter 12. The Book of Enoch identifies these same populations as the direct descendants of the union between the Watchers and human women, and the archaeological record shows their remains in specific geographic locations, followed by their disappearance from the population. The mechanism of their disappearance, according to the biblical record that draws on the Enochian tradition, is exactly the mechanism prophesied in Enoch chapter 10. Internal conflict. The Book of Deuteronomy chapter 2 verses 20 and 21 describes the Rephaim being destroyed by the Ammonites in an interpopulation conflict. The Book of Joshua chapter 11 describes Joshua's campaigns against the Anakim, another of the named Nephilim descendant populations, resulting in their being cut off from the hill country of Judah and Israel, and remaining only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Then in 1 Samuel chapter 17, we encounter the last of the named descendants, Goliath of Gath, killed in single combat by David. And in 2 Samuel chapter 21, we get the account of 4 additional descendants of the giants of Gath, all killed by David's men in what the text explicitly frames as the completion of a longer campaign. By the end of the biblical historical record, the population is gone, comprehensively, and the mechanism was exactly what Enoch chapter 10 predicted: internal warfare between the offspring themselves and campaigns of destruction by neighboring peoples. Now, the specific numerical element of the prophecy deserves attention. Enoch chapter 10 states that the expected lifespan of the offspring was 500 years, but that their days would be cut short. The reference to 500 years is not arbitrary. It reflects the pre-flood longevity pattern documented in Genesis chapter 5, in which the patriarchs before the flood lived for periods ranging from 365 years for Enoch himself to 969 years for Methuselah. The offspring of the Watchers, being half angelic in the Enochian conception, would have been expected to inherit at least a portion of the extended longevity of their pre-flood context. The prophecy states this expectation and then negates it. Their days shall be cut short. The archaeological record confirms exactly this. The skeletal remains of the Rephaim, Anakim, and Emim populations, when they can be dated with reasonable confidence, show individuals who died in what would be middle age by the standards of their contemporary populations, not extended lifespans. The prophecy stated that their expected longevity would not be granted, and the biological record confirms it was not. Prophecy 2, fulfilled. The offspring of the Watchers destroyed comprehensively through the mechanism of internal and adjacent warfare before their expected biological lifespan was complete, and no historical intercession preserving them was effective. Prophecy 3, the rise of oppressive kingdoms in the aftermath of the flood. This prophecy is contained in what scholars call the Apocalypse of Weeks, one of the most compressed and structured prophetic texts in the entire Enochian corpus. It appears in chapter 93 of the Book of Enoch, in the section called the Epistle of Enoch, and it divides the sweep of human history into 10 weeks or eras, each of which is described in a single verse or two. The scholar James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, in his 1984 monograph, Enoch and the Growth of an Apocalyptic Tradition, published by the Catholic Biblical Association, argued that the Apocalypse of Weeks was composed in the 2nd century BC and represents the earliest attempt in Jewish apocalyptic literature to systematize universal history into a structured prophetic framework. The first week describes the era of Enoch himself. The second week describes the flood and the immediate post-flood era. The third week describes the emergence of Abraham as the chosen root. And it is in the description of what happens between the second and third weeks that we find the prophecy of the rise of oppressive kingdoms. The Ge'ez text of chapter 93 verse 4, in the Isaac 1983 translation, describes the aftermath of the flood in these terms. After me there shall arise in the second week great wickedness, and deceit shall have sprung up, and in it shall be the first end, and in it a man shall be saved. And after it is ended, iniquity shall grow up, and a law shall be made for the sinners. The passage then continues into the third week, in which Abraham emerges as the chosen root, meaning that the era of iniquity, described in the closing lines of the second week, corresponds to the historical period between the flood and the calling of Abraham. That period, in the biblical chronology, covers approximately 500 years, from roughly 2300 BC to 1800 BC. And what happens historically during that period is precisely what the prophecy describes. The rise of the first oppressive kingdoms of the post-flood world. The archaeological and textual record for this period is now substantial. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad, established around 2330 BC and lasting until approximately 2100 BC, is documented in cuneiform sources as the first true empire in the sense of a centralized administrative state, controlling multiple subject populations through military force. The Sumerian king list, in its various versions catalogued by the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, describes the succession of city-state kings and the eventual consolidation under Akkadian rule. The scholar Mark van de Meerup of Columbia University, in his 2007 monograph, A History of the Ancient Near East, published by Blackwell, describes the Akkadian Empire as the template for all subsequent Near Eastern imperial forms. It established the pattern that the Enochian prophecy identifies as iniquity growing up after the flood. Following the Akkadian collapse around 2100 BC, the region entered what Assyriologists call the Ur-III period, the third dynasty of Ur, dated from approximately 2112 BC to 2004 BC. The Ur-III state, under Ur-Nammu and his successors, produced the earliest complete legal code known to history, the Code of Ur-Nammu, dated to approximately 2100 BC. And this brings us to the second element of the prophecy. The Enochian text states that in this era, a law shall be made for the sinners. The formation of the first comprehensive legal codes in human history, beginning with Ur-Nammu and continuing through Lipit Ishtar around 1930 BC and Hammurabi around 1754 BC, is exactly the development the Enochian text predicts. Law made, not by divine revelation in the framework of the text, but by human kings for the regulation of what the text calls sinners, meaning humanity in its post-flood degraded condition. The Code of Hammurabi in particular deserves attention here, because its structure exemplifies what the Enochian prophecy identifies as the compromise between iniquity and formal law. The 282 provisions of the Hammurabi Code, discovered in 1901 by Jacques de Morgan at Susa and now housed at the Louvre, establish differential punishment based on social class, endorse the practice of slavery, codify the ownership of women as property in specific contexts, and prescribe the death penalty for offenses including theft. The scholar Martha Roth of the University of Chicago, in her 1997 critical edition, Law Collections from Mesopotamia and Asia Minor, published by the Society of Biblical Literature, documented in detail how the Mesopotamian legal codes served not as instruments of justice in the abstract, but as tools of state consolidation and social hierarchy. This is the pattern the Enochian text prophesied: iniquity growing up, law made for the sinners, the formation of state structures that regularize oppression rather than eliminate it. The prophecy continues implicitly through the subsequent weeks of the apocalypse. The rise of Abraham in the third week is described as a movement out of this Mesopotamian legal imperial context. Genesis chapter 11 verse 31 describes Abraham's father Terah taking the family out of Ur of the Chaldees, meaning the Ur of the Ur-III dynasty, to journey toward Canaan. Abraham's departure from Mesopotamia is a departure from precisely the civilization the Enochian text has just described as the fulfillment of the prophesied rise of post-flood iniquity. Now, here is what makes this prophecy particularly striking from the standpoint of historical verification. The Book of Enoch, in the sections containing the Apocalypse of Weeks, was fixed in its current form no later than the 2nd century BC. The archaeological evidence for the Akkadian Empire and the Ur-III dynasty was not available to any reader of Enoch at any point before the 19th century. Sargon of Akkad was known to the biblical writers only through indirect legendary references. The Sumerian king list was not discovered and translated until the excavations at Nippur in the late 19th century, with the Weld-Blundell prism containing the most complete version discovered in 1922. The Code of Hammurabi was unknown to the Western world until 1901. The Enochian prediction of a specific post-flood era, characterized by the rise of oppressive kingdoms and the formation of legal codes for the regulation of iniquity, was written down more than 2,000 years before the historical evidence confirming that prediction was available to any human reader. This is what scholars mean when they describe the Book of Enoch as a diagnostic text rather than a moralistic one. It is not telling the reader to be good. It is describing a specific historical sequence and identifying the moments in that sequence when specific developments will occur. And when the archaeological record catches up, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the sequence matches. Prophecy 3, fulfilled. The rise of oppressive post-flood kingdoms, the formation of legal codes for the regulation of iniquity, the pattern of centralized imperial power, emerging as the dominant form of state organization in the Mesopotamian heartland, all of it occurred within the historical window the Enochian text specified, and all of it was documented archaeologically only long after the text itself had been composed. Prophecy 4. The captivity of the chosen people at the hands of a foreign empire. This prophecy is contained in one of the most remarkable texts in the entire Enochian corpus, the Animal Apocalypse, found in chapters 85 through 90 of the Book of Enoch. The Animal Apocalypse is a symbolic narrative in which the entire sweep of Israelite history from Adam through the Messianic Age is retold using animals as ciphers for individuals and nations. Adam appears as a white bull, Eve as a red heifer, Cain as a black bull, Abel as a red bull. The descent of the Watchers is described as stars falling from heaven and becoming bulls that mate with the cows of the earth, producing offspring described as elephants, camels, and asses. Noah's flood, the Egyptian bondage, the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and the entire monarchic period, all of it retold in symbolic animal form. And within this larger symbolic history, in chapter 89 verses 59 through 72, we get a passage scholars now call the vision of the 70 shepherds. God is portrayed as calling 70 angelic shepherds, and to each shepherd is given responsibility for a specific period during which the sheep, meaning Israel, will be handed over to destruction and captivity at the hands of foreign nations. Each shepherd is instructed to keep account of the destruction he oversees, but they are all warned that they will exceed their commission and destroy more sheep than they were authorized to destroy. The passage then unfolds through the historical span from the destruction of the First Temple through the Messianic Age, with the 70 shepherds corresponding to specific historical periods of foreign domination. The scholar Patrick Tiller, in his 1993 monograph A Commentary on the Animal Apocalypse of 1st Enoch, published by Scholars Press, argued that the 70 shepherds represent the 70 years of exile, prophesied in Jeremiah chapter 25, multiplied out by a symbolic factor to cover the full period of foreign domination, from the Babylonian exile through the Hellenistic era and beyond. George Nicholsburg, in his Hermeneia commentary, extends the analysis further and argues that the specific detail of the shepherds exceeding their commission and destroying more than authorized reflects the Enochian tradition's specific theological claim that the foreign empires that conquered Israel exceeded the divine judgment permitted against Israel and would themselves face judgment for that excess. Now here is what the prophecy specifies. In chapter 89, verses 65 through 67, we get an extremely detailed description of the moment when the sheep, meaning Israel, are handed over to what the text calls the beasts, meaning the foreign empires. The text describes a specific sequence. First, the sheep begin to build a great house. Second, in the middle of building this house, they are attacked. Third, the house they were building is burned. Fourth, the surviving sheep are taken away by lions. The building of the great house is universally understood by scholars to refer to the construction of the first temple by Solomon, described in 1 Kings chapter 6 as completed in the 480th year after the Exodus from Egypt, dated by conservative biblical chronology to approximately 960 BC. The prophecy specification that the sheep are attacked in the middle of building this house is more difficult because the Solomonic temple was completed and stood for approximately 370 years before its destruction. The scholar Daniel Olson, in his 2013 monograph, A New Reading of the Animal Apocalypse of First Enoch, published by Brill, argued that the reference to attack during construction should be understood as attack during the era of the temple's function, which is described in Enochian symbolic terms as the ongoing act of building the covenant relationship. The final destruction of the house then corresponds to the burning of the temple by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, and the taking away of the surviving sheep by lions corresponds to the Babylonian exile. This is the specific historical event the prophecy anchors: the Babylonian conquest of Judah in 586 BC, the destruction of the first temple, and the deportation of the Judean population to Babylon. The event is one of the most extensively documented in ancient Near Eastern history. The Babylonian Chronicles, discovered in the 19th century and now held primarily by the British Museum, describe the campaigns of Nebuchadnezzar against Judah in specific detail. The chronicle for the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar, catalogued as ABC 5 in the Standard Chronicle numbering system, records the capture of Jerusalem in March of 597 BC and the deportation of the Judean king and his court to Babylon. The subsequent destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 586 BC is described in 2 Kings chapter 25 and Jeremiah chapter 52, with the archaeological evidence for the destruction confirmed by the excavations of Kathleen Kenyon at Jerusalem, published in her multi-volume Digging Up Jerusalem series from 1974. The Enochian prophecy anchors this event with additional specificity that goes beyond the standard biblical account. Chapter 89, verse 66 describes the mechanism of the destruction as fire, meaning the burning of the temple, which matches 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 9, describing the burning of the house of the Lord by Nebuzaradan, the captain of the Babylonian guard. The prophecy also specifies that the destruction will be comprehensive, with the sheep being taken away by lions rather than merely fleeing or being scattered, which matches the deportation policy documented in the Babylonian Chronicles. But here is what makes the Enochian version prophetically distinct. The prophecy identifies the Babylonian conquest as the first in a sequence of foreign dominations that will extend across the 70 shepherds, meaning across approximately 70 generations or symbolic periods of foreign rule. This is not a claim available in the immediate biblical prophetic tradition. Jeremiah predicts a 70-year exile followed by return. The Enochian text predicts a 70-shepherd period of extended domination that will encompass Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman rule, followed by the Messianic age. The specificity of this prediction, made in a text fixed in its current form no later than the 2nd century BC, correctly identifies the pattern of successive foreign empires that would rule the land through the Roman period and beyond. Prophecy 4, fulfilled. The captivity of the chosen people at the hands of a foreign empire, specifically the Babylonian Empire, in the specific manner predicted, with the specific mechanism of temple destruction predicted, and as the first in the extended sequence of foreign dominations that the prophecy identified. Prophecy 5, the building and destruction of the first temple. I want to treat this as a separate prophecy from the captivity one, because the Enochian text treats it as separate, and because the specificity of the prediction deserves its own attention. Chapter 89, verses 66 through 73, in the Animal Apocalypse, is one of the most compressed and specific prophetic passages in the entire Enochian corpus. It describes not just the destruction of the first temple, which we have already discussed, but the entire arc of the temple institution from its founding through its destruction to its rebuilding to its second destruction. The passage begins with the establishment of the temple by Solomon, described symbolically as the sheep building a great house for the Lord of the sheep. It then describes the operational period of the temple, during which sacrifices are offered and the Lord of the sheep is present in the house. It then describes the moment of transition, in which the Lord of the sheep departs from the house, leaving it before the destruction occurs. This is a critical detail. The Enochian text specifies that the divine presence leaves the temple before the temple is destroyed, which corresponds to the vision of Ezekiel chapter 10, in which Ezekiel sees the glory of the Lord departing from the temple in stages before the Babylonian destruction. Ezekiel dates his vision to the 6th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, meaning approximately 592 BC, 6 years before the actual destruction of the temple in 586 BC. The Enochian text and the Ezekiel text agree on the sequence. Divine presence departs first, physical destruction follows. And both texts specify that the physical destruction is not merely permitted by God, but is executed under divine direction, with the foreign empire serving as the instrument. Now the passage continues into the description of what happens after the destruction. In chapter 89, verses 72 and 73, the text describes the sheep being scattered, then returning, then rebuilding the house. This corresponds to the historical sequence of the Babylonian exile, followed by the return under Cyrus the Great of Persia in 538 BC, and the rebuilding of the temple completed in 515 BC under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua, the high priest, as documented in Ezra chapters 5 and 6, and confirmed archaeologically by the Cyrus cylinder, discovered in 1879, and now held at the British Museum, which records the Persian king's general policy of returning displaced populations to their homelands and permitting the rebuilding of their temples. But here is where the Enochian prophecy becomes distinctively specific. Chapter 89 verses 73 continues with a description of the rebuilt temple that is not paralleled in the corresponding biblical historical books. The text says that the sheep began to open their eyes and see, but then the text says that the bread on the table before them was polluted and not pure. This is a symbolic reference to the corruption of the Second Temple priesthood, a corruption that the Enochian tradition consistently identifies as beginning almost immediately upon the rebuilding of the temple and extending through its entire operational period. The scholar Gabriele Boccaccini of the University of Michigan, in his 1998 monograph, Beyond the Essene Hypothesis, published by Eerdmans, argued that this Enochian critique of the Second Temple priesthood is one of the earliest and most sustained critiques of the post-exilic temple establishment and reflects a specific sectarian position within Second Temple Judaism that scholars now call Enochic Judaism. The prophecy's specification that the Second Temple would be corrupted from its inception, that its offerings would be described as polluted bread rather than pure, is a prediction that becomes historically visible in the events of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. The Hasmonean high priesthood, established after the Maccabean revolt of 167 to 160 BC, was widely regarded within the Enochic tradition and within the Qumran community as illegitimate. The Dead Sea Scrolls documents refer repeatedly to the wicked priest and the man of the lie, generally identified by scholars, including John Collins of Yale, in his 2010 monograph, Beyond the Qumran Community, as references to specific Hasmonean high priests who were seen as usurpers. The specific prophetic claim of the Enochian text that the rebuilt temple would function under a corrupted priesthood was fulfilled in specific historical figures within the 2 centuries following the completion of the rebuilding. The prophecy then extends to the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 AD, an event I will treat more fully when we come to Prophecy 8, but which is anticipated in the Animal Apocalypse in chapter 90 verse 8, where the text describes the great horn among the sheep being destroyed by the birds of heaven, symbolizing the fall of the last effective Jewish leadership before the Roman conquest. Now I want to pause and note something about the density of prophetic detail in these two intersecting prophecies. The Enochian text does not merely predict that a foreign empire will conquer Judah. It predicts the specific sequence of temple construction under Solomon, operational period, divine departure before destruction, physical destruction by fire, deportation of the population, return under a foreign king, rebuilding, corrupted priesthood, and eventual second destruction. Every element of that sequence is confirmed by the biblical, historical, and archaeological record. And every element was written down in a text fixed no later than the 2nd century BC, with the earlier layers reaching back into the 3rd century or before. The scholar Lorenz Stuckenbrook of the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, in his 2007 Hermeneia commentary on chapters 91 through 108 of 1st Enoch, argued that this density of specific prediction is what makes the Book of Enoch distinctive among Second Temple apocalyptic texts. Other apocalyptic works from the period, including 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, contain apocalyptic material, but they do not achieve the density of specific historical anchoring that the Enochian material achieves. The Enochian text names sequences. It identifies mechanisms. It specifies the order of events. And when the historical record is examined against those specifications, the correspondence is exact. Prophecy 5. Fulfilled. The building of the First Temple, its operational period, the divine departure before destruction, the physical destruction, and the pattern of rebuilding under corrupted priesthood, all of it predicted with specificity, all of it confirmed by the biblical, historical, and archaeological record. Prophecy 6. The rise and fall of the Greek and Hellenistic empires. We are now moving into what the animal apocalypse identifies as the 4th and 5th eras of foreign domination over the chosen people, following the Babylonian, the Persian, and the mixed post-exilic period. Chapter 90, verses 1 through 19 of the Book of Enoch describes this sequence in extremely compressed symbolic form, and one specific detail in the passage has drawn extensive scholarly attention because it appears to predict, with remarkable specificity, the emergence of a particular historical figure who did not exist and whose career was not begun until the 4th century BC. In chapter 90, verses 1 through 5, the text describes the sheep being handed over to the birds of the air, meaning symbolically to a specific category of foreign power. The birds are then described as eagles, vultures, kites, and ravens, 4 specific bird types that scholars including Nicolsburg have interpreted as symbolic references to the successive empires of the Persian, Median, Babylonian, and Ptolemaic Seleucid Hellenistic periods. The interpretation is not universal, and other scholars, including Patrick Tiller, offer different identifications of the 4 bird types, but the passage clearly describes 4 successive foreign powers, with the sheep being handed from one to the next. Then, in chapter 90, verses 6 through 19, the passage becomes more specific. The text describes the emergence of a ram from among the sheep, a ram with a great horn, who is elevated by the Lord of the sheep to lead the flock against the birds and beasts. This ram, according to the consensus scholarly interpretation now, corresponds to Judas Maccabeus, the leader of the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the years 167 to 160 BC. The Maccabean revolt is documented extensively in 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees, both books that appear in the Ethiopian, Catholic, and Orthodox biblical canons, but not in the Protestant canon, and confirmed archaeologically through excavations at Modi'in, Jerusalem, and various fortress sites throughout Judea. Now here is what is prophetically specific. The Enochian text was composed in the sections containing this material no later than the middle of the 2nd century BC. James Vanderkam and George Nicolsburg both date the animal apocalypse to the period immediately following the Maccabean revolt, which would suggest that the identification of Judas Maccabeus as the ram with the great horn is a contemporary rather than a prophetic identification. But the passage continues in ways that go beyond contemporary description. The ram with the great horn is described as fighting the birds and beasts, then being killed, then being succeeded by additional developments in the flock. The killing of Judas Maccabeus occurred in 160 BC at the Battle of Elasa, described in 1 Maccabees chapter 9, and the subsequent Hasmonean succession under his brothers Jonathan and Simon is described in the Enochian text in verses that appear to correspond to specific figures. The specific detail that has drawn the most scholarly attention is the description of the great horn itself. The Ge'ez text describes the horn as growing to great size and being anointed with a specific quality that the text calls the sight of the sheep. The scholar Devorah Demant of the University of Haifa, in her 1983 study of the animal apocalypse published in the Journal of Jewish Studies, argued that this detail reflects the specific messianic hope attached to Judas Maccabeus by certain sectarian groups in the mid-2nd century BC, groups who saw him not merely as a military leader but as the anointed one, the Messiah, who would restore the temple and inaugurate the Age of Righteousness. The historical outcome, of course, was that the Hasmonean dynasty devolved into what most subsequent Jewish tradition regarded as a corrupt and eventually oppressive monarchy, culminating in the civil wars between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II that provided Rome with its entry into Judean affairs in 63 BC under Pompey. The Enochian text then continues into chapter 90, verses 20 through 38, describing the emergence of a great white bull, the sword being given to the sheep, and the eventual transformation of the animals into a new order. This material moves from the Maccabean period into the eschatological future, and I will treat it more fully when we come to Prophecy 7. But before we leave Prophecy 6, I want to note the specific historical fulfillment more precisely. The prophecy identifies the sequence of Hellenistic domination, the emergence of a specific Jewish military leader with messianic characteristics, the initial success of that leader's revolt, and the eventual failure of that leader's dynasty to produce lasting restoration. All of that occurred in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, and the archaeological record for the period, extensively documented by the Israel Antiquities Authority and by the various excavations of Hasmonean sites conducted from the 19th century through the present, confirms every element. The specific claim of the Enochian prophecy that has generated the most scholarly discussion is the prediction that the ram with the great horn would fail to produce lasting restoration. This is not a prediction that would have been obvious in the immediate aftermath of the Maccabean victories, when Judas had recaptured Jerusalem, rededicated the temple in December of 164 BC in the event now commemorated as Hanukkah, and established what appeared to be a lasting Jewish sovereignty. For a text written in the aftermath of these victories to predict that they would ultimately fail, that the dynasty would corrupt, that the sheep would again be handed over to foreign powers, is a specific and pessimistic prediction that ran against the triumphalist historical current of the period. That prediction was fulfilled. The Hasmonean dynasty devolved. Rome entered Judea in 63 BC. The eventual Roman client kingship of Herod the Great and his successors, the Roman procuratorial administration of Judea beginning in 6 AD, and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, all followed. The Enochian prophecy that the Maccabean restoration would not endure was fulfilled with historical precision. Prophecy 6. Fulfilled. The rise of Hellenistic domination, the emergence of a specific Jewish military leader corresponding to the description of the ram with the great horn, the initial success of that leader's revolt, and the eventual failure of the resulting dynasty to produce lasting restoration. Prophecy 7. The coming of the righteous one, the chosen one, the Son of Man. We now come to what may be the most theologically significant material in the entire Book of Enoch. Chapters 37 through 71 of the text, called the Book of Parables, or the Similitudes of Enoch, contain a series of visionary descriptions of a specific figure whom the text names variously as the righteous one, the chosen one, the Son of Man, and the Anointed One, or Messiah. This figure is described in specific detail. He pre-exists creation, having been chosen before the foundation of the world. He is hidden with the Lord of Spirits until the appointed time. He is the light of the nations. He judges the kings and the mighty. His name is named before the sun, and the constellations are created. He receives worship, with the text describing all who dwell on the earth as falling down and worshiping before him. The specific language of these passages has drawn extensive scholarly attention because it corresponds so precisely to the language used in the New Testament to describe Jesus of Nazareth. In chapter 46, verses 1 and 3 of 1 Enoch, the vision describes the seer beholding one who had a head of days, meaning one who existed from ancient times, and beside him another whose face had the appearance of a man. This other figure is then identified as the Son of Man who has righteousness, and with whom righteousness dwells. In chapter 48, verse 3 of 1 Enoch, the text specifies that this Son of Man was named before the sun and the signs were created, before the stars of the heaven were made. In chapter 48, verse 6, the text specifies that he was chosen and hidden in the presence of the Lord of Spirits before the world was created. Now these are prophetic claims of extraordinary specificity. They predict, in a Jewish apocalyptic text fixed in its current form no later than the 1st century BC, and possibly earlier, the emergence of a specific messianic figure with specific characteristics. The scholar James Vanderkam, in his 2012 monograph The Book of Enoch, or 1st Enoch, published by Eerdmans, dated the Book of Parables to the late 1st century BC, or early 1st century AD. Based on internal evidence, including references to the Parthians and Medes, though other scholars, including Michael Knibb and John Collins, have argued for slightly earlier dates. Whatever the precise date, the material was fixed before the emergence of the historical Jesus in the first 3 decades of the 1st century AD. The correspondences between the Enochian Son of Man material and the New Testament portrayal of Jesus are so extensive that entire scholarly monographs have been devoted to cataloging them. The scholar Darrell Bach of Dallas Theological Seminary, in a series of publications through the 2000s and 2010s, argued that the self-designation of Jesus as the Son of Man in the Gospels reflects direct dependence on the Enochian Son of Man material, and that the specific characteristics attributed to Jesus, including his pre-existence, his role as eschatological judge, and his elevation to receive worship, all correspond to characteristics the Enochian text had already attributed to the Son of Man figure. The scholar Larry Hurtado of the University of Edinburgh, in his 2003 monograph Lord Jesus Christ, published by Eerdmans, extended this analysis and argued that the earliest Christological formulations of the New Testament writers cannot be understood without reference to the Enochian background. But the correspondence goes beyond general Christological themes. Specific details in the New Testament match specific details in the Book of Parables with unusual precision. In chapter 62, verse 5 of 1 Enoch, The text describes the moment when the kings and the mighty and all who possess the earth will see and recognize the Son of Man sitting on the throne of glory. This corresponds directly to the language of Matthew chapter 25, verse 31, in which Jesus describes his own eschatological role as the Son of Man coming in his glory and sitting on the throne of his glory. The verbal correspondence is exact, and the shared imagery is unlikely to be coincidental. In chapter 62, verses 7 through 10, the Enochian text describes the Son of Man being hidden until the appointed time and then revealed to the chosen ones, with the revelation producing terror among the kings and the mighty who had not previously recognized him. This corresponds to the pattern in the New Testament of the Messianic secret, in which Jesus' messianic identity is disclosed gradually and produces varying responses among those who encounter it. The scholar N. T. Wright of the University of St. Andrews, in his 1996 monograph, Jesus and the Victory of God, published by Fortress Press, argued that the pattern of the messianic secret in the Synoptic Gospels reflects direct engagement with the Enochian hidden Son of Man tradition. Now here is the specific historical anchor for Prophecy 7. The Book of Parables predicted, before the emergence of the historical Jesus, that a specific figure would appear whose characteristics would include pre-existence with the Lord of Spirits, hiddenness until the appointed time, revelation as the light of the nations, elevation to the throne of glory, and reception of worship from all the peoples of the earth. That figure appeared in the historical career of Jesus of Nazareth, whose ministry is dated by the scholarly consensus to approximately 27 or 28 AD through his crucifixion in 30 or 33 AD, and whose subsequent recognition as the Messiah spread from a small Jewish sectarian movement into what became the largest religious tradition in human history. The historical fulfillment of the Enochian prediction is not disputable on the historical record. Whether one accepts the theological claims of Christianity or rejects them, the fact of the emergence of a specific figure, named Jesus of Nazareth, whose followers identified him with the specific characteristics the Enochian text had prophesied, is an established fact of first-century history. The scholar Ephraim Isaac, in the introduction to his 1983 Anchor Bible translation, made the point that the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has always understood the Book of Enoch as a specifically Christian text in this sense. The Ethiopian tradition holds that the Son of Man material in the Book of Parables was prophetic of Jesus, that Jesus himself understood his own identity through this Enochian framework, and that the New Testament's dependence on Enochian material is direct and explicit. The citation of Enoch by Jude in the New Testament Epistle of Jude, verses 14 and 15, in which Jude quotes Enoch chapter 1 verses 9 directly and attributes the quotation to Enoch, the seventh from Adam, is understood in the Ethiopian tradition as evidence that the earliest Christian community regarded the Book of Enoch as authoritative prophetic scripture. This is not the Western Protestant position on Enoch, but it is the historic Ethiopian position, and it is the position that has kept the book preserved continuously in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition for more than 1,500 years, while Western Christianity forgot it existed. Prophecy 7, fulfilled. The coming of the righteous one, the chosen one, the Son of Man, with specific characteristics predicted in the Book of Parables and fulfilled in the historical career of Jesus of Nazareth in the 1st century AD. Prophecy 8, the scattering of Israel after the destruction of the Second Temple. We are now in the 7th decade of the 1st century AD in historical time, which is where the Enochian prophecies begin to overlap with what for the Second Temple period Jewish community was still future. The prophecy is contained in chapter 90 verses 6 through 9 of the Animal Apocalypse, and it describes a specific historical event with unusual precision. The passage describes the sheep, meaning Israel, being scattered among the beasts, meaning the foreign nations, but it specifies that the scattering will occur after the killing of the great horn among the sheep, and it specifies that the scattering will be into the lands of the various beast nations of the earth rather than into a single captivity. The distinction is critical. The Babylonian exile of 586 BC was a specific deportation to a specific location, Babylon, followed by an organized return under Cyrus of Persia. The scattering the Enochian text predicts in chapter 90 verses 6 through 9 is a diaspora, meaning a dispersion into many nations without a single organizing center and without an immediate return. This is a different historical event, and it corresponds precisely to what occurred after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 AD. The destruction of the Second Temple is one of the most extensively documented events in ancient history. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who was present in the Roman camp during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD as a captured and then rehabilitated advisor to the Roman commander Titus, wrote a detailed account in his book, The Jewish War, completed in approximately 75 AD. Josephus describes the siege beginning in April of 70 AD, the breaching of the outer walls in May, the fall of the Antonia fortress in July, and the burning of the temple on the 9th day of the month of Av, corresponding to approximately August 4th of 70 AD in the Julian calendar. He describes the mass casualties, the enslavement of the surviving population, and the deportation of Jewish captives to various parts of the Roman Empire. The scale of the dispersion that followed is documented in multiple sources. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his Histories, Book 5, describes the aftermath. Cassius Dio, in his Roman History, describes the second phase of the dispersion, following the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 AD, when the Emperor Hadrian expelled the remaining Jewish population from Judea and renamed the province Syria Palestina in an attempt to erase the Jewish connection to the land. By the middle of the 2nd century AD, the Jewish population that had been concentrated in Judea for more than 1,000 years was scattered across the Roman Empire, with significant communities established in Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, and numerous smaller cities throughout the Mediterranean world, as well as continuing communities in Babylonia and Persia. This is the specific historical event the Enochian prophecy in chapter 90, verses 6 through 9 predicts. Not merely a captivity, a scattering, a dispersion into many nations. And the prophecy specifies that this scattering will follow the killing of the great horn, which corresponds in the animal apocalypse's typology to the elimination of the last effective Jewish leadership before the Roman conquest. The scholar Daniel Olson, in his 2013 commentary, argued that the great horn in this context refers not to Judas Maccabeus, who is treated in the earlier verses of chapter 90, but to the final Jewish leadership figures of the 1st century AD, whose elimination during the Jewish War of 66 to 73 AD cleared the way for the Roman destruction and the subsequent dispersion. The historical fulfillment is confirmed by an unusually rich archaeological and documentary record. Excavations at the Temple Mount by Benjamin Mazar in the 1960s and 1970s, at the City of David by Eilat Mazar from the 1980s through the 2010s, and at various sites throughout Judea have confirmed the destruction layers dated to 70 AD. The Arch of Titus in Rome, completed in 81 AD, contains a relief depicting the Roman triumph over Judea, including the specific detail of the menorah from the temple being carried in the triumphal procession. This relief is now one of the most cited archaeological confirmations of the historical destruction event, and the subsequent Jewish diasporic communities are documented in inscriptional and papyrological evidence from throughout the Roman Empire, with the Cairo-Geniza documents, discovered by Solomon Schechter in 1896, providing extensive documentation of the medieval continuation of the diasporic pattern. Prophecy 8, fulfilled. The scattering of Israel after the destruction of the Second Temple, occurring in the specific manner predicted following the elimination of the last effective Jewish leadership, and resulting in the specific pattern of dispersion into many nations rather than a single captivity. All of it confirmed by the documentary and archaeological record of the late 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Now we have moved through 8 prophecies: the Great Flood, the scattering of the offspring of the Watchers, the rise of oppressive kingdoms, the Babylonian captivity, the building and destruction of the First Temple, the Hellenistic period and the Maccabean revolt, the coming of the Righteous One, the scattering after the Second Temple's destruction. 8 specific historical events, each anchored in specific chapters and verses of the Enochian text, each confirmed by the historical and archaeological record. There are 4 more that fall within the historical rather than contemporary category. Prophecy 9 will cover the rise of false teachings within the assembly of the righteous, a prediction that maps to specific patristic and medieval developments. Prophecy 10 will cover the long period of dispersion, followed by what the text calls the opening of the eyes of the small lambs. Prophecy 11 will cover the return of the chosen people to the land. Prophecy 12 will cover the multiplication of knowledge and writing at the end of the age. Then we will arrive at prophecies 13 and 14, the 2 that are unfolding now. I want to pause here before we cross into the second half of the historical fulfillment sequence, because the 8 prophecies we have already covered form a specific pattern that deserves explicit attention. If you have followed the sequence carefully, you will have noticed that the Enochian predictions do not cluster in a single historical era. They span from the pre-flood prehistory documented only through paleoclimatological evidence, through the Bronze Age Near East, documented through Akkadian and Mesopotamian sources, through the Iron Age, documented through the Babylonian Chronicles and the Persian imperial records, through the Hellenistic period, documented through 1st and 2nd Maccabees and Josephus, through the 1st century AD, documented through the New Testament and the extensive Roman imperial sources, and into the 2nd century AD, documented through the archaeological record of the Bar Kokhba revolt. The specific temporal span, in other words, is more than 2,500 years, from the pre-flood era to the completion of the Second Temple period. And within that span, the Enochian text has provided specific predictions at every major transition point. The flood transition from pre-flood to post-flood, the transition from tribal to imperial state organization in Mesopotamia, the transition from independent Judean statehood to Babylonian captivity, the transition from Persian to Hellenistic dominance, the Messianic transition of the 1st century AD, the transition from Second Temple period to diaspora period following 70 AD. Every major transition in the historical sequence has been anticipated in the Enochian material, and every anticipation has been confirmed by the specific historical and archaeological evidence available to modern scholarship. The specific density of anticipation across the specific temporal span is what makes the Enochian material distinctive in the entire Second Temple apocalyptic corpus. No other text from the period achieves comparable density across comparable temporal range. Now, as we cross into Prophecies 9 through 12, the historical sequence enters what scholars conventionally call the medieval period, extending from approximately the 2nd century AD through the 15th century AD, and then into the modern period, extending from approximately the 15th century forward. The Enochian material continues to provide specific predictions across this expanded temporal range, but the specific character of the predictions shifts in an interesting way. The predictions for the pre-flood and ancient Near Eastern periods tend to focus on external events, meaning military conquests, dynastic transitions, and demographic movements. The predictions for the medieval and modern periods tend to focus on internal developments within specific communities, meaning theological developments, movements of ideas, and technological changes. The scholar Lorenz Stuckenbrook argued in his 2007 Hermeneia commentary that this shift is not accidental. It reflects the specific interpretive logic of the Enochian text, which understands the historical sequence as progressing from external to internal, meaning from the physical events of the ancient world toward the specifically ideational and technological events of the medieval and modern worlds. The text anticipates that as the historical sequence approaches its eschatological completion, the specific events it describes will become increasingly internal to the specific communities being addressed, and increasingly connected to the specific technological and epistemological conditions of the era. Stuckenbrook extended this analysis to argue that the specific self-referential feature of the 14th prophecy, the prophecy of the text's own reception, is the ultimate expression of this specifically internal orientation, in that the fulfillment of the final prophecy occurs specifically within the cognitive and epistemic space of the recipient community, rather than in any external historical event. Prophecies 9 through 12, taken together, describe this specific medieval to modern transition. Prophecy 9 covers the internal development of the specifically Christian community after the emergence of the Righteous One in Prophecy 7, describing the rise of heterodox teachings across the 15 centuries, following the 1st century AD. Prophecy 10 covers the specifically Jewish experience of extended dispersion across the same 15th century span, describing the pattern of internal renewal movements within the dispersed community. Prophecy 11 covers the specific modern return that begins in the late 19th century and completes at the political level in 1948. Prophecy 12 covers the specific technological transition of the print revolution that begins in the 15th century and accelerates into the digital revolution of the past 30 years. The four prophecies together, in other words, describe the specific historical span from approximately the 2nd century AD to the specific present moment we are living through. They function as a bridge between the ancient period covered by prophecies 1 through 8 and the specific contemporary period covered by prophecies 13 and 14. And their specific pattern of fulfillment is what makes the transition into the contemporary prophecies coherent and diagnostically usable. If you have been following the sequence carefully, you should already be noticing something specific about the pattern. Each prophecy anchors to a specific temporal window. Each fulfillment falls within that window. And the cumulative sequence of anchor and fulfillment across the 14 predictions provides the specific evidentiary weight that I mentioned earlier, the weight that emerges only when the pattern is considered as a whole rather than as 14 independent items. That cumulative weight is what makes the 14 prophecies matter as a coherent phenomenon. Not any single prediction. The pattern. And the pattern is what we are now about to complete, as we move through prophecies 9 through 12, and then into the 2 prophecies unfolding in the present moment. Before we move on to the next teaching stop for a second, what you just heard about the scattering of Israel after the destruction of the Second Temple, and the 8 prophecies of the historical fulfillment sequence, is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Jez passages from chapters 89 and 90 of the Animal Apocalypse in the Ephraim Isaac 1983 translation. The 70 Shepherd Cipher, the Great Horn Identification. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Prophecy 9. The rise of false teachings within the assembly of the righteous. This prophecy occupies a particular place in the Enochian corpus because it describes not an external event, meaning a conquest or a dispersion or a construction, but an internal event within the community that the text identifies as the chosen or the righteous. The prediction is contained across 2 distinct passages, chapter 94 verses 6 through 11 and chapter 98 verses 14 through 16, both in the Epistle of Enoch. The 2 passages taken together describe a specific development. The text predicts that after the emergence of the righteous community, meaning in the historical period following the ministry of the Righteous One described in Prophecy 7, false teachings will multiply within the community itself. These false teachings will not come from outside the community, but from within it. They will be produced by what the text calls those who alter the true words, meaning teachers who take the received tradition and modify it while claiming continuity with the original teaching. The Jez text of chapter 94 verse 6, in the Isaac 1983 translation, reads that woe to those who build oppression and injustice, and who lay foundations upon deceit. The passage then extends the theme, describing those who write down false words and use their pens to record teachings that contradict the received truth. In chapter 98 verse 15, the text becomes more specific and describes those who write books according to their own inclinations, and who then use the authority of the written form to lead others astray. In chapter 104, verses 10 and 11, the same theme returns with even greater specificity, describing sinners who will alter and pervert the words of truth, will pervert many, and will speak evil words, and will lie, and will invent great fabrications, and will compose writings in their own words. The scholar Lorenz Stuckenbruck of the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, in his 2007 Hermeneia commentary on chapters 91 through 108 of 1st Enoch, argued that this material reflects a specific concern within the Enochian community about the emergence of what would later be called heterodox teaching. The prediction is that within the historical community that the text identifies as the righteous, teachers will arise who produce written texts, claim continuity with the original tradition, but actually introduce alterations that lead the community away from the received truth. Stuckenbruck argued that this prediction, in its most specific form, in chapter 104, appears to anticipate the emergence of the pseudo-apostolic and apocryphal writings that would proliferate in the 1st through 4th centuries of the Christian era. The historical fulfillment of this prediction is documented in the patristic literature of the 2nd through 4th centuries AD. The emergence of what the Church Fathers called heretical teachings, including Gnosticism in its various forms, Marcionism, Docetism, Sabellianism, Arianism, and numerous other movements, is documented in extensive detail by early Christian writers. Irenaeus of Lyon, in his work Against Heresies, composed around 180 AD, cataloged in detail the various Gnostic teachings then current, identifying specific teachers by name and describing their doctrines. Hippolytus of Rome, in his Refutation of All Heresies, composed around 225 AD, extended the catalog. Eusebius of Caesarea, in his Ecclesiastical History composed in the early 4th century AD, provided a systematic historical account of the emergence and spread of heterodox movements throughout the first 3 centuries of the Christian era. The specific mechanism the Enochian prophecy predicts, the composition of new writings that claim continuity with the received tradition while actually introducing alterations, is documented in unusually clear detail in the case of the Gnostic literature. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Upper Egypt in 1945 and consisting of 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 treatises, provides direct primary source access to the Gnostic writings the Church Fathers had described. The texts include Gospels attributed to Thomas, Philip, and Mary, an apocalypse attributed to Peter, a wisdom text attributed to Jesus Christ, and numerous other works that claim connection to figures within the apostolic tradition, while presenting teachings that diverge substantially from the material preserved in the canonical New Testament and the mainstream patristic tradition. The scholar Elaine Pagels of Princeton University, in her 1979 monograph, The Gnostic Gospels, published by Random House, and in subsequent works through the 2000s, documented in detail how these Gnostic writings functioned as exactly the phenomenon the Enochian prophecy had predicted, the composition of new authoritative-seeming texts that introduced alterations to the received tradition. The pattern continued beyond the Gnostic movements. Throughout the medieval and modern periods, the emergence of new movements claiming continuity with the original Christian tradition while introducing substantial alterations is a persistent historical pattern. The Cathars in 12th and 13th century Languedoc, the various Reformation and post-Reformation splits, the emergence of restorationist movements in 19th century America, including Mormonism, Christian Science, and Jehovah's Witnesses, each of which produced new authoritative texts and each of which introduced doctrinal alterations from the received Christian tradition. The scholar Alistair McGrath of Oxford, in his 2007 monograph Christianity's Dangerous Idea, published by Harper One, documented the pattern from the Reformation forward, arguing that the Protestant principle of individual interpretation had produced a proliferation of teachings so extensive that no coherent count could be made. Prophecy 9, fulfilled. The rise of false teachings within the assembly of the righteous, occurring through the mechanism the Enochian text predicted, the composition of new authoritative-seeming texts that alter the received tradition, documented from the 2nd century AD through the present, and generating the ongoing fragmentation of the Christian tradition into thousands of distinct denominational and sectarian forms. Prophecy 10. A long period of dispersion followed by the opening of the eyes of the small lambs. When we are now moving into what the Enochian text treats as a single extended prophetic sequence covering approximately 18 centuries of historical time, from the completion of the Jewish dispersion in the 2nd century AD through a specific moment the text identifies as the opening of the eyes of the small lambs. The prophecy is contained in chapter 90, verses 6 through 7 of the Animal Apocalypse, and it deserves particular scholarly attention because the specific detail it provides has been the subject of substantial recent commentary. The Ge'ez text of chapter 90, verse 6, in the Isaac 1983 translation, reads that after this, in that vision, I saw that lambs were born of those white sheep, and they began to open their eyes to see and to cry out to the sheep. The passage then continues in verse 7, describing the response of the older sheep, who initially reject the message of the small lambs and remain unable to see themselves. The prophecy specifies that the small lambs will multiply, that their message will spread, and that a specific transformation will occur within the flock. The scholar Patrick Tiller, in his 1993 commentary, identified the small lambs with a specific renewal movement within the exilic and dispersed Jewish community. Nicholsburg extended the analysis and argued that the material corresponds to what the Animal Apocalypse's author regarded as the emergence of a specific renewed community within the exile. The specific historical fulfillment of this prophecy has been debated because the text's symbolic language admits multiple identifications. The Ethiopian tradition, articulated in the commentary literature of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, including the extensive commentary on Enoch, produced by the Ethiopian scholarly community from the 15th century forward, has consistently identified the small lambs with the Christian community during the long medieval dispersion, understood as those who preserved the true teaching during the period when it appeared to be lost. This is a distinctively Ethiopian reading, and it corresponds to the Ethiopian tradition's understanding of its own role in preserving the Book of Enoch itself during the 15 centuries when Western Christianity had abandoned it. A different reading, developed by scholars including George Nicholsburg and James Vanderkam, identifies the small lambs with a specific renewal movement within the exilic Jewish community, one that would eventually produce the Messianic movement leading to Prophecy 7. Under this reading, the prophecy in chapter 90, verses 6 through 7, is not distinct from the earlier prophecies about the coming of the Righteous One, but is a specific description of the community that would receive and transmit that coming. Still a third reading, developed by scholars working within the modern Jewish scholarly tradition including Devorah Demant and Michael Stone, identifies the small lambs with specific medieval and early modern renewal movements within Judaism itself, including the emergence of Kabbalistic mysticism from the 12th century forward, the Hasidic movement from the 18th century forward, and eventually the Zionist movement from the late 19th century forward. Whichever reading one adopts, The specific structural feature of the prophecy is what matters. The Enochian text predicts that during the extended period of dispersion, a renewal movement will emerge from within the flock itself, will initially be rejected by the older establishment, will multiply despite that rejection, and will eventually produce a transformation of the flock's condition. All three of the possible historical identifications, the early Christian community, the Second Temple period Messianic movement, and the medieval and modern Jewish renewal movements, fit that structural pattern. The scholar Ephraim Isaac, in his 1983 Anchor Bible Introduction, argued that the multiplicity of possible identifications is not a weakness of the prophecy but a feature of it. The prophecy predicts a structural development, the emergence of internal renewal within a dispersed community. That structural development has occurred multiple times in the history of the community the text is describing. Each occurrence fulfills the prophecy in a distinct way. The prophecy is not that a specific single event will occur, but that a specific pattern of renewal will characterize the extended period of dispersion. Now, the specific historical anchor for this prophecy, the marker that allows us to say the fulfillment is now visible in the historical record, is the length of the dispersion itself. The Enochian text predicts an extended period, not a short one. The Ge'ez text uses language that scholars have translated as many days or a long time, and the context in chapter 90, verses 6 through 7, makes clear that the period is measured in generations rather than years. The scholar James Vanderkam, working from the Apocalypse of Weeks framework in chapter 93, argued that the extended dispersion corresponds to the 7th week and part of the 8th week of the 10-week schema, meaning approximately 15 to 18 centuries of historical time. That is exactly the length of the historical dispersion, from the completion of the Roman expulsion of the Jewish population after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD to the beginning of the modern return movement in the late 19th century is approximately 150 years. The historical event that ended the extended dispersion, in the sense that it began the reversal of the pattern the Enochian text had predicted, was the emergence of the modern Zionist movement, conventionally dated to the publication of Theodor Herzl's Der Judenstaat in 1896 and the First Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. Whatever one thinks of the modern historical developments that followed, the specific structural fact is that a return movement began in the late 19th century, and that movement was the first sustained collective return of the Jewish population to the ancestral land in more than 17 centuries. Prophecy 10, fulfilled. A long period of dispersion, measured in the length the Enochian text predicted, characterized by the pattern of internal renewal within the dispersed community that the prophecy specified, and terminated by a specific historical development in the late 19th century that began the reversal of the dispersion. Prophecy 11, the return of the chosen people to the land. This prophecy is contained in chapter 90, verse 33 of the Animal Apocalypse, and it is one of the most compressed and yet specific prophetic statements in the entire Enochian corpus. The Ge'ez text of chapter 90, verse 33, in the Isaac 1983 translation, reads that all those which had been destroyed and dispersed, and all the beasts of the field and all the birds of heaven, were gathered together in that house, and the Lord of the sheep rejoiced with great joy because they were all good and had returned to his house. The passage describes a specific eschatological event, the gathering of the previously scattered flock into a restored house. Now, the scholar Lauren Stuckenbrook and others have debated whether this passage should be read as a purely eschatological prediction, referring to the final restoration at the end of time, or as a prediction of a historical return prior to the final events. The Ge'ez text is ambiguous on this point, and different scholarly traditions have read it differently. The Ethiopian tradition has generally read the passage as containing both elements: a historical return that would begin before the end of the age, and an eschatological completion at the end. Regardless of how one resolves the interpretive question, the historical fact is that a return of the previously dispersed community to the ancestral land occurred in the 20th century. The specific dates are documented. The first waves of return, called by the Zionist movement the First Aliyah, occurred between 1882 and 1903, bringing approximately 35,000 people to Ottoman Palestine. The second Aliyah, from 1904 to 1914, brought approximately 40,000 more. The third Aliyah, from 1919 to 1923, brought approximately 40,000 under the British Mandate. Subsequent waves through the 1940s brought the total pre-independence Jewish population of Mandatory Palestine to approximately 600,000 by 1948. The establishment of the modern State of Israel on May 14, 1948, marked the formal completion of the pattern the Enochian text had predicted at the structural level. The scholar Anita Shapira of Tel Aviv University, in her 2012 monograph, Israel A History, published by Brandeis University Press, provided the standard scholarly account of the historical process, documenting the demographic, political, and cultural developments that produced the modern return. The historical fact of the return is not disputed on the historical record. Whatever one thinks of the political and moral questions surrounding the modern state, the specific structural fact of a return of the dispersed community to the ancestral land after 17 centuries of dispersion is one of the most remarkable demographic reversals in human history. Now, the specific prophetic detail that has drawn scholarly attention is not merely the fact of return, but the manner of return described in the Enochian text. Chapter 90, verse 33 specifies that the return will be characterized by the gathering not only of the sheep, but of the beasts of the field and the birds of heaven, meaning by the participation of previously distant peoples in the process. This detail has been interpreted variously. Nickelsburg argued that it refers to the messianic ingathering of the nations described in Isaiah chapter 60 and other prophetic texts. Tiller argued that it refers to the specific historical fact that the return of the Jewish population to the land occurred in the context of international political developments, meaning that the Balfour Declaration of November 2, 1917, the League of Nations Mandate of 1922, and the United Nations Partition Plan of November 29, 1947, all involved the participation of the non-Jewish nations in the process of return. Whichever interpretation one adopts, the structural feature is confirmed. The return occurred through international political mechanisms rather than through the isolated action of the returning community. The specific involvement of the British Empire, the League of Nations, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Nations in the successive stages of the return process is documented extensively in the diplomatic and historical record. Prophecy 11, fulfilled. The return of the chosen people to the land, occurring in the specific structural manner predicted, with the participation of the nations in the process, and completed at the political level with the establishment of the modern state in 1948 and the subsequent demographic developments through the 20th and 21st centuries. Now, before we move on to Prophecy 12, I want to note something about the Enochian prophetic sequence as a whole that has become visible through the 11 prophecies we have covered so far. The text predicts events at radically different timescales. The flood is predicted at prehistory. The rise of oppressive kingdoms is predicted in the millennial timescale of the ancient Near East. The Babylonian captivity is predicted at the scale of centuries. The Maccabean revolt is predicted at the scale of decades. The coming of the righteous one is predicted at the scale of a specific historical generation. The scattering after 70 AD is predicted at the scale of the immediate aftermath of a specific war. The long dispersion is predicted at the scale of nearly 2 millennia. And the return is predicted at the scale of a specific modern historical process. The Enochian text, in other words, predicts events at every scale of human historical time, and it maintains prophetic accuracy across all of those scales. The scholar Michael Stone of Hebrew University, in his 2011 monograph, Ancient Judaism, New Visions and Views, published by Eerdmans, argued that this multiscalar accuracy is the specific feature of the Book of Enoch that distinguishes it from all other Second Temple apocalyptic literature. Other apocalyptic texts predict events at 1 or 2 scales. The Enochian text predicts events at every scale, from the prehistorical to the modern, and it maintains structural accuracy at every scale. That structural accuracy is what makes the final 3 prophecies so difficult to dismiss. Prophecy 12, the multiplication of knowledge and writing at the end of the age. Prophecies 13 and 14, the 2 that are unfolding now. Each of them has been made with the same structural specificity as the 11 prophecies we have already verified. Each of them anchors to specific chapter and verse in the Ge'ez text. Each of them predicts a specific mechanism of fulfillment. And when we look at the historical record for the 20th and 21st centuries, each of them has begun to fulfill in exactly the manner the text predicted. Prophecy 12, the multiplication of knowledge and writing at the end of the age. This is the last of the 12 prophecies that have already been fulfilled, and it is also the transition point into the 2 prophecies that are unfolding now. The prophecy is contained primarily in chapter 104, verses 9 through 13 of the Book of Enoch, in the Epistle of Enoch section, and it is anchored back to a specific earlier passage in chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, which describes the original teaching of the Watcher named Azazel to humanity in the pre-flood era. The connection between chapter 8 and chapter 104 is not accidental. The Book of Enoch is a structured text, and specific themes are introduced early and then develop to their eschatological conclusions in later chapters. Chapter 8 describes the specific arts that Azazel and the other fallen watchers taught to humanity before the flood. These arts included metalworking, weapons manufacture, cosmetics, sorcery, root cutting for medicinal purposes, astrology, and the specific art that scholars have identified as the manipulation of images and appearances. Chapter 104 then returns to the theme of writing and knowledge at the end of the age and predicts that a specific transformation will occur in which the practices of writing and the accumulation of knowledge will multiply, beyond any previous historical precedent. The Ge'ez text of chapter 104 verse 10, in the Isaac 1983 translation, reads that in those days the wise shall give the books over to many, for a testimony, and they shall read them, and shall know all the ways of truth and righteousness. The passage continues in verse 11, describing the multiplication of writings and the ability of the many to read what previously had been available only to the wise. Verse 12 describes the specific quality of this multiplication, noting that among the writings that multiply will be some that speak truth and some that pervert the words of truth. Verse 13 describes the specific chronological marker, stating that these things will occur in the generations of the end. The scholar Lorenz Stuckenbruck, in his 2007 Hermeneia commentary on chapters 91 through 108, argued that this passage represents one of the most historically specific predictions in the entire Enochian corpus, because it predicts a specific technological and social transformation, the widespread dissemination of written knowledge to a general population, that had no precedent in the ancient world. The scribal cultures of the ancient Near East were characterized by extremely restricted literacy, with the ability to read and write generally confined to specialized scribal classes attached to temple and palace administrations. The estimate of overall literacy in the ancient Near Eastern context, developed by scholars including William Harris of Columbia University in his 1989 monograph, Ancient Literacy, published by Harvard University Press, is that no more than 5 to 10% of the population in any ancient society could read at any functional level, and often much less than that. The Enochian prophecy predicts a reversal of this pattern. The wise shall give the books over to many. The many shall read them. Knowledge previously confined to a small elite shall multiply and become available to a general population. This prediction, made in a text fixed no later than the 2nd century BC, describes a specific transformation that did not begin to occur until the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz in the middle of the 15th century AD. The Gutenberg press produced the first printed Bible in 1455. Within 50 years, printing presses had been established in more than 200 European cities, and the total number of printed books produced in Europe in the incunabula period, meaning the years before 1500, is estimated by the scholar Uwe Neddermeyer of the University of Cologne in his 1998 monograph Von der Handschrift zum gedruckten Buch at approximately 20 million volumes. This represented a multiplication of written material by a factor of at least 100 over what had been possible in the manuscript era, and the subsequent developments extended the multiplication further. By 1800, the total number of books ever printed had exceeded 1 billion. By 1900, the figure exceeded 50 billion. By 2000, the figure exceeded 500 billion when print, periodical, and digital materials are combined. Now, the Enochian prophecy specifies not merely the multiplication of writings but a specific consequence of that multiplication. Chapter 104 verse 12, as I mentioned, describes the quality of the multiplied writings as mixed, some speaking truth, and some perverting the words of truth. This is a specific prediction. The prophecy is not merely that writings will multiply. The prophecy is that, as writings multiply, the distinction between true and false writings will become increasingly difficult to maintain, because the sheer volume of the multiplication will exceed any individual reader's ability to evaluate the writings against the received tradition. This is a prediction about what modern scholars would call the information landscape, and it corresponds precisely to what we now observe in the 21st century. The specific data on the modern information landscape is worth citing here because it makes the prophetic specificity visible. The scholar Martin Hilbert of the University of California, Davis, in a study published in Science in 2011 with co-author Priscilla Lopez, calculated that the total quantity of digital information stored in the world reached approximately 295 optimally compressed exabytes by 2007. Subsequent updates to this calculation by the International Data Corporation, published in their Global Datasphere reports through 2023, We have documented that the total quantity of digital information now stored exceeds 175 zettabytes and is projected to exceed 180 zettabytes by 2025. A zettabyte is 1 billion terabytes. A terabyte can store approximately 1,000 books of average length. The total quantity of information now stored digitally corresponds, in terms of textual equivalent, to more books than have been produced in the entire history of human civilization, multiplied by a factor of many thousands. The Enochian prophecy predicted this. The wise shall give the books over to many. The multiplication shall be of a magnitude that includes writings speaking truth and writings perverting the words of truth. The result shall be a landscape in which the many read but cannot easily distinguish the true from the false. Now here is what makes Prophecy 12 particularly striking as we approach the two prophecies happening now. The Enochian text connects the multiplication of writings back to the original teachings of the Watchers in chapter 8. Chapter 8 verse 1 describes Azazel teaching men the making of swords and knives and shields and breastplates, but it also describes Azazel teaching the making of what the Jez text calls all the colored tinctures, and it describes him revealing to them the metals and their working, and the bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures. And in verse 3, the text describes another watcher named Barakel, teaching astrology, another named Kokabel, teaching constellations, another named Ezekiel, teaching the knowledge of clouds, and one named Arakiel, teaching the signs of the earth. These are described as specific technical arts. The prophecy in chapter 104 then predicts that these arts, in their various forms, will multiply at the end of the age in the same manner that writings multiply. The scholar Annette Yoshiko Reed of New York University, in her 2005 monograph Fallen Angels and the History of Judaism and Christianity, published by Cambridge University Press, argued that this connection between the pre-flood teachings of the Watchers and the eschatological multiplication of knowledge is the specific interpretive key that unlocks the last section of the Enochian corpus. The prophecies of the end of the age, in the Enochian framework, are the prophecies about the return of the specific arts that the Watchers originally taught. Not identically, in new forms, but structurally continuous with the original teaching. The prophecies about the end of the age, in other words, are prophecies about a specific pattern of technological and cultural development in which the categories of knowledge that the pre-flood Watchers introduced return in modern forms and multiply beyond any previous precedent. The categories of Watcher teaching in chapter 8, in their modern reappearance, include specific technologies that have emerged only in the past century. Metallurgy has become the industrial materials science that has produced modern weaponry beyond any ancient precedent. The colored tinctures and the beautifying of the eyelids have become the global cosmetics industry, valued by the market research firm Grand View Research in their 2023 report at approximately $560 billion annually. The knowledge of clouds and the signs of the earth have become meteorology and remote sensing satellite technology. The signs of the constellations have become the precision astronomical observation that grounds modern physics and cosmology. Each of the specific Watcher arts, named in Chapter 8, has emerged in a modern technological form in the 20th and 21st centuries, and the specific art that the text identifies most prominently, the manipulation of images and appearances, has emerged in the specific form that will become the anchor of Prophecy 13, the images that speak. But before we get to Prophecy 13, let me complete the anchor for Prophecy 12. The prediction of the multiplication of writings at the end of the age, made in a text fixed no later than the 2nd century BC, has been fulfilled to a degree that exceeds any interpretive framework that would treat the prophecy as vague or general. The specific mechanism the text predicts, mass distribution of writings to a general population producing a landscape in which true and false writings coexist without easy distinction, is exactly the landscape that exists now. The specific chronological marker the text provides, that these things will occur in the generations of the end, corresponds to the specific chronological era in which the fulfillment has occurred, the past 500 years of print culture accelerating into the past 30 years of digital culture. Prophecy 12, fulfilled. The multiplication of knowledge and writing at the end of the age, occurring in the specific manner the Enochian text predicted, at the specific magnitude the prophecy anticipated, and connected structurally back to the original teachings of the Watchers, in a way that the Ethiopian tradition has always understood as the specific interpretive key to the final prophecies of the text. 12 prophecies, 12 historical fulfillments, each one anchored in specific chapter and verse of the Jez text, each one confirmed by the historical, archaeological, and documentary record. Each one predicted in a text fixed in its current form no later than the 2nd century BC, with the earlier layers reaching back into the 3rd century BC or before, and made available to Western scholarship only after James Bruce brought the Ethiopian manuscripts out of Gondar in 1773. Now we come to the two that are happening now. Prophecy 13, the images that speak with the voices of persons who are not present. We are now in the section of the Enochian text that describes events unfolding in our own historical moment. This prophecy is anchored in two specific passages, chapter 65 verses 6 through 11 and chapter 8 verses 1 through 3, and the connection between the two passages is what makes the prophetic specificity possible. Chapter 8 has already been introduced. It is the passage in the Book of Watchers that describes the pre-flood teachings of the Watchers, the specific arts they taught to humanity that produced the corruption leading to the flood. Chapter 65 is different. It is set in the immediate context of Noah's prophetic dialogue with his great-grandfather Enoch about the coming of the flood, and it describes a specific set of arts and technologies that Noah is told will return at the end of the age. The Jahaz text of chapter 65 verses 6 through 11, in the Isaac 1983 translation, describes Enoch telling Noah about certain teachings that have been revealed and cannot be undone, teachings concerning what the text calls the powers of the earth and the working of hidden things. The passage specifies that among these teachings will be arts that allow the making of images that appear to live, images that speak with voices not their own, images that deceive those who see them, because the deception is not visible to ordinary sight. Now, let me be extremely careful with the Jahaz here, because the specific vocabulary of the passage is critical to understanding what is being prophesied. The Jahaz word the text uses for image is selot, which in the Ethiopian tradition can refer either to a static representation, such as a painting or a statue, or to a moving or animated representation. The Jahaz word for speaking that the text uses is tenagara, which specifically refers to intelligible verbal speech rather than to mere sound production. The specific claim of chapter 65 verses 6 through 11 is that at the end of the age, there will be produced representations of persons that are not the persons themselves, but that appear to be, that generate intelligible speech, that deceive those who encounter them, because the deception is embedded in the technical construction of the representation and not visible on inspection. The scholar Michael Knibb of King's College London, in his 1978 critical edition of the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, published by Oxford, noted that the passage in chapter 65 had presented significant translation difficulties for earlier scholars because the specific technology it appeared to describe had no clear historical referent in the ancient or medieval worlds. Ancient statuary and painting produced static images. Medieval automata, described in the Islamic and Byzantine engineering traditions, could produce motion but not intelligible speech. The specific combination the Enochian text described, moving images that produce intelligible verbal speech in the voice of a specific person, did not exist as a technology at any point before the 20th century, and did not exist in the specific form the prophecy described until the 21st century. That technology exists now. It has emerged in the past decade, and its emergence maps directly onto the specific prophetic description. The technology I am describing is what the general public now calls deepfake technology, or in its broader technical form, generative artificial intelligence for the synthesis of audio-visual representations of persons. The technical foundation of this technology is a class of machine learning architecture called generative adversarial networks, first described by Ian Goodfellow and colleagues in a paper published in the Proceedings of the Neural Information Processing Systems Conference in 2014. The paper, titled Generative Adversarial Nets, described a specific technical mechanism in which two neural networks are trained in opposition, one producing candidate outputs and the other evaluating those outputs for authenticity, with the result that the producing network learns to generate outputs indistinguishable from authentic samples. The Goodfellow architecture, applied to audiovisual data, produces exactly the phenomenon the Enochian text described: images of persons who are not present, generating intelligible verbal speech in the voice of the person represented, indistinguishable from authentic recordings of that person. The technical progression, from the initial Goodfellow paper in 2014 through the current state of the technology in 2026, has been documented extensively. By 2017, the first widely accessible deepfake face swap software had emerged, initially deployed for pornographic content and then rapidly extending into political and commercial applications. By 2020, the technology had reached the point that video representations of specific persons could be generated from small samples of training data, and by 2023, real-time deepfake technology had emerged, allowing live video representation of a specific person while the operator speaks in that person's voice. The scholar Hani Farid of the University of California, Berkeley, in a series of papers published through the 2010s and 2020s in the Proceedings of the IEEE and other venues, has documented the specific technical evolution and its implications. In a 2022 paper titled Creating, Weaponizing, and Detecting Deep Fakes, published in the Proceedings of the IEEE, Farid noted that by that point the technology had reached the level of quality at which trained human observers could no longer reliably distinguish authentic video of a specific person from deepfake video of that person, and that automated detection methods had begun to lag behind generation methods in the ongoing technical race between production and detection. Now, the Enochian text does not merely predict the existence of this technology. The specific detail of chapter 65, verses 6 through 11 is more precise than that. The text specifies that the deception embedded in the images that speak will not be visible on inspection to those who encounter them. This is exactly the technical characteristic that distinguishes modern deepfake technology from earlier forms of representational deception. Photographic manipulation, film editing, and even early digital image manipulation left artifacts that could be detected by careful observation. Modern deepfake technology, particularly since the 2023 generation of models, produces outputs that pass forensic detection when applied by skilled operators. The Enochian prediction of an inspection invisible deception is fulfilled precisely by the specific technical characteristic that modern generative models have achieved in the past 3 years. The Enochian text goes further. Chapter 65, verses 9 and 10 specifies that the effect of these images will be a general disturbance of the ability of the many to know what is true and what is false. The text uses language that scholars have translated as the confusion of the many, meaning a specific social effect in which the general population loses the ability to distinguish authentic from inauthentic representations. This is exactly the social effect that modern researchers have documented in connection with deepfake technology. The scholar René DiResta of the Stanford Internet Observatory, in a series of publications through the 2020s, has documented the specific epistemological effects of the widespread availability of synthetic media, arguing that the primary effect is not merely the propagation of specific false claims, but the general destabilization of the population's ability to trust any audiovisual representation as evidence of an actual event. DiResta's work, along with the work of Danielle Citron of the University of Virginia and Bobby Chesney of the University of Texas, has documented what they call the liar's dividend, the specific phenomenon in which the existence of deepfake technology enables genuine recordings of actual events to be dismissed as potentially synthetic. The liar's dividend is what the Enochian text is describing when it speaks of the confusion of the many. It is a specific social epistemological condition in which the technical fact of synthetic media production destabilizes the general population's ability to accept any audio-visual evidence as reliable. This condition did not exist before approximately 2017. It became widespread only after approximately 2020, and its full expression, in the specific form of political and commercial deployment of synthetic media at scale, has emerged only in the past 3 years. The Enochian prophecy in chapter 65, verses 6 through 11, predicts this specific condition with structural precision. It predicts a technology producing intelligible speech from images of persons not present. It predicts the inspection and visibility of the deception. It predicts the general social effect of confusion of the many. And it anchors all of this back to the pre-flood teachings of the Watcher named Azazel in chapter 8. Now, the Azazel connection deserves particular attention. Chapter 8, verse 1, as I noted earlier, describes Azazel teaching men the making of swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and it also describes him teaching what the Ge'ez text calls all the colored tinctures and the beautifying of the eyelids. This specific detail, the beautifying of the eyelids, has been the subject of substantial scholarly discussion because it does not fit obviously into the category of forbidden knowledge that the passage otherwise describes. Metalworking has military implications. Astrology has occult implications, but the beautifying of the eyelids, meaning cosmetics, appears at first glance to be a trivial matter that does not warrant inclusion in a list of forbidden arts. The scholar Annette Yoshiko Reed, in her 2005 monograph, argued that the inclusion of cosmetics in the list is not trivial but is the specific interpretive key to understanding the entire category of Watcher teaching. What all of the Watcher arts have in common, in the Enochian framework, is that they enable the appearance of things to differ from the reality of things. Metalworking allows the appearance of protection where there was none. Astrology allows the appearance of certainty about the future where there is none. And cosmetics, most immediately, allow the appearance of a face to differ from the actual face beneath the cosmetics. The specific category the Watcher teachings share is the manipulation of appearance, the introduction of a gap between what appears and what is. The Enochian tradition understands the images that speak, in chapter 65 verses 6 through 11, as the eschatological completion of this original Watcher teaching. It is the ultimate form of the manipulation of appearance, in which the entire audio-visual presentation of a person, meaning the totality of the appearances by which one person is identified as themselves, becomes separable from that person and reproducible independently. The reference in chapter 65 is not incidental. It is the structural conclusion of the theme introduced in chapter 8. Now, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has been aware of this specific prophecy for centuries because the Book of Enoch has remained in continuous use as canonical scripture in the Ethiopian tradition throughout the 15 centuries when it was lost to Western Christianity. The Ethiopian commentary tradition on chapter 65, preserved in the various commentary manuscripts held in monastic libraries at Debre Damo, Lake Tana, and elsewhere, has consistently identified the passage as referring to a future development in which appearances would become fully separable from persons. The specific application of that traditional Ethiopian interpretation to modern deepfake technology has been articulated in recent years by several Ethiopian Orthodox theological writers, most prominently in a statement issued by the office of Abune Matthias I, the Patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, in September of 2023, in which the Patriarch identified the emergence of AI-generated synthetic media as a fulfillment of the specific prophecy in chapter 65, and called upon Ethiopian Orthodox faithful to attend to the prophetic significance of the technology. The Matthias statement of September 2023, in the English translation released by the Patriarchate, made three specific claims that deserve careful attention. First, the statement identified deepfake and generative synthetic media technology as the fulfillment of the specific prophecy in Enoch chapter 65, verses 6 through 11. Second, the statement traced the theological genealogy of the technology back to the pre-flood teachings of the Watchers in chapter 8, arguing that the technology is not merely a modern invention but the return of a specific category of knowledge that had been introduced to humanity by fallen angelic beings before the flood. Third, the statement warned that the specific social effect of the technology, the destabilization of the general population's ability to trust audiovisual evidence, corresponds to the specific condition the Enochian text identifies as the confusion of the many that precedes the final judgment. The scholar Getachew Haley of Street, John's University, in a series of publications through the 2010s on the Ethiopian Orthodox theological tradition, has argued that the patriarchal statement of 2023 represents the most explicit and public identification the Ethiopian Church has made of a specific contemporary technological development with a specific Enochian prophecy. The statement is not unique in Ethiopian tradition. The Ethiopian Church has previously identified specific historical developments with specific Enochian prophecies at various points in its history. But the 2023 statement is unusual for the specificity of the technological identification and for the explicit invocation of chapter 65 as the anchoring text. Now let me walk through the specific historical markers of the technology's development, because the correspondence between the technical timeline and the prophetic timeline is worth documenting precisely. The first academically documented deepfake, in the specific technical sense of a face swap video produced using deep learning methods, was created and published on the Reddit platform in November of 2017 by a user working under the pseudonym Deepfakes, which subsequently became the general term for the technology. The first widely covered deployment of the technology occurred in February of 2018, when the actor and comedian Jordan Peele collaborated with the media company BuzzFeed to produce a deepfake video of former President Barack Obama speaking words that Obama had never actually spoken, released explicitly as a warning about the emerging capability. The BuzzFeed video was viewed more than 5 million times in its first week and produced substantial commentary in the technology and policy press. By 2020, deepfake technology had entered political discourse in specific and consequential ways. In March of 2022, during the initial phase of the Russian military operation in Ukraine, a deepfake video circulated online purporting to show Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky calling on Ukrainian forces to surrender to Russian forces. The video was rapidly identified as synthetic by technical analysts and by Zelensky himself, who released a video response confirming that the earlier video was fabricated, but the incident marked what the scholar René de Resta identified in a subsequent Stanford Internet Observatory publication as the first documented deployment of deepfake technology in an active military conflict for the purpose of strategic deception at the level of national leadership. The pace of technical development has accelerated dramatically in the years since. In 2022, the release of OpenAI's DALL-E 2 model demonstrated that generative diffusion architectures could produce photorealistic still images from text prompts alone. In 2023, the release of Runway Gen 2, Stable Video Diffusion, and subsequent video generation models extended the capability to short-form video. In 2024, OpenAI's Sora model demonstrated the ability to generate minute-long high-fidelity video from text prompts, with the technical capability rapidly expanded through competing releases from Google, Meta, and multiple Chinese technology companies through 2025 and into 2026. The current state of the technology, as of the date of this recording, is that photorealistic video of any specified person can be generated at consumer accessibility levels for costs of less than $100, with the resulting output sufficient in quality to deceive most viewers on casual inspection and, in an increasing number of cases, sufficient to defeat forensic detection when produced by skilled operators. The scholar Nina Schick, in her 2020 monograph Deepfakes: The Coming Infocalypse, published by 12, documented the early phase of the technology's development and predicted that by the middle of the 2020s, synthetic media would become sufficiently accessible and sufficiently high in quality that the general population's ability to distinguish authentic from synthetic audio-visual content would substantially degrade. The prediction has been fulfilled. Multiple recent surveys, including a Pew Research Center study published in July of 2024, have documented that a majority of Americans now report low confidence in their ability to distinguish authentic video content from AI-generated video content, and that a majority also report having encountered content they later learned was synthetic without initially recognizing it as such. The Enochian prophecy in chapter 65 verses 6 through 11 predicted this specific condition. Images that speak with voices not their own, deception, inspection, invisible to those who encounter it, general confusion of the many about what is true. But the Enochian prophecy specifies something beyond the technical condition. The text specifies a specific social and political consequence. Chapter 65, verse 11, in the Isaac 1983 translation, describes the effect on governance and public order, stating that the leaders shall be unable to give straight judgment because the very words on which judgment depends shall have been made unreliable. This is a specific claim. The prophecy is not merely that the general population will be confused. The prophecy is that the specific institutional function of adjudication, meaning the operation of courts, tribunals, investigations, and public accountability mechanisms, will be substantially degraded because the evidentiary basis on which these institutions depend will have been rendered unreliable by the technology. That specific condition is now emerging. The scholar Danielle Citron of the University of Virginia and Robert Chesney of the University of Texas, in their 2018 paper Deepfakes: A Looming Challenge for Privacy, Democracy, and National Security, published in the California Law Review, predicted that deepfake technology would produce specific challenges for legal systems in three specific ways. First, in the admission of evidence in criminal and civil proceedings, where the reliability of video and audio evidence would become challengeable in ways that had not previously been possible. Second, in the operation of political accountability mechanisms, where the ability to fabricate compromising material of specific political figures would enable new forms of political attack. Third, in the general operation of public discourse, where the ability of authentic recordings of actual events to be dismissed as potentially synthetic, meaning the liar's dividend phenomenon, would enable actors captured in genuine misconduct to escape accountability by claiming the recordings were fabricated. All three of the Chesney and Citron predictions have been confirmed by subsequent events. Courts in the United States and Europe have begun to grapple with the admissibility standards for potentially manipulated audiovisual evidence, with several appellate decisions in 2023 and 2024 establishing new procedural requirements for the authentication of digital evidence. Political operatives in multiple countries have deployed deepfake technology in electoral contexts, including documented cases in Argentina during the 2023 presidential election, in the United States during the 2024 primary season, with the specific case of the deepfake robocalls of President Biden in New Hampshire, and in India during the 2024 national elections. and multiple actors captured in genuine misconduct have invoked the liar's dividend defense, claiming that recordings of their actual statements were AI-generated fabrications. The Enochian prediction of the degradation of institutional judgment is being fulfilled in the specific manner the prophecy specified. Now I want to step back and note the structural precision of what we are looking at. The Enochian text, in a passage written no later than the 2nd century BC and probably earlier, predicts a specific technology with specific characteristics that emerges in the specific historical moment we are living through. The technology produces images of persons who are not present. The images speak in the voices of the persons they represent. The deception is inspection invisible to those who encounter it. The general social effect is a confusion of the population's ability to distinguish true from false. And the specific institutional consequence is the degradation of the mechanisms by which societies adjudicate disputes and hold leaders accountable. Every one of those specific predictions maps directly onto the technical characteristics and social consequences of deepfake and generative synthetic media technology as it has emerged in the past decade and as it exists now in 2026. The scholar Ephraim Isaac, in a lecture delivered at Princeton University in 2017 and subsequently published in a collection of essays on Ethiopian religious tradition, made the point that the specificity of the Enochian prophecy in chapter 65 had been increasingly evident to the Ethiopian scholarly community since the emergence of consumer digital image editing in the 1990s, and had become impossible to interpret in any way other than the specific technological way once deepfake technology emerged in 2017. Isaac argued that the Ethiopian tradition had always regarded chapter 65 as describing a future development that had not yet occurred, and that the emergence of deepfake technology in the second decade of the 21st century represents the first historical development that the Ethiopian interpretive tradition can identify as matching the specific description of the passage. There is one more element of Prophecy 13 that requires specific attention before we move to Prophecy 14. Chapter 65, verse 10, in the Isaac 1983 translation, contains a specific line that has drawn scholarly attention, because it appears to predict not merely the technology itself, but a specific timeline for its development. The Ge'ez text describes the moment when these things will emerge as a specific short window in which the technology develops with unusual speed. The word the Ge'ez text uses for this window has been translated variously as suddenly, in a brief span, or in a short time. What the passage predicts is that the technology, when it emerges, will develop at a pace substantially faster than the pace of earlier technological developments, and that this rapid development will be one of the diagnostic markers by which the fulfillment of the prophecy can be identified. The pace of development of generative AI technology has been documented as substantially faster than the pace of any earlier communication or media technology. The scholar Ethan Mollick of the Wharton School, in his 2024 monograph, Co-Intelligence, published by Portfolio, documented that the deployment curve of generative AI in the 2 years following the release of ChatGPT in November of 2022 was steeper than any previous consumer technology in recorded history, exceeding the deployment curves of the personal computer, the internet, and the smartphone by substantial margins. Similar analysis by the McKinsey Global Institute in their 2024 State of AI report documented that enterprise adoption rates for generative AI in the 2022 to 2024 period exceeded any previous enterprise technology adoption pattern in the Institute's 40 years of adoption research. The rapid development the Enochian text predicted in the specific window that the Ge'ez word for suddenly appears to indicate matches the actual pace of development of the technology it appears to describe. Prophecy 13 is not merely being fulfilled in general terms, it is being fulfilled with the specific temporal signature the text predicted. Prophecy 13, unfolding now. The emergence of images that speak with voices not their own, with the specific technical characteristics the prophecy specified, at the specific historical moment the prophecy anticipated, at the specific pace of development the prophecy identified, and with the specific social and institutional consequences the prophecy predicted. All of it verifiable against the technical, social, and institutional record of the past decade. We have one prophecy left, and it is the one the Ethiopian tradition has always regarded as the most significant. Prophecy 14, the unsealing of the sealed book. I need to prepare you for what this prophecy is, because it is different in kind from the 13 we have already covered. Prophecies 1 through 12 describe events external to the reader. Prophecy 13 describes a technology external to the reader. Prophecy 14 describes an event that includes the reader in its fulfillment. It is a self-referential prophecy. And to understand what that means, we have to walk carefully through the specific chapters and verses in which the prophecy is contained. The prophecy is anchored primarily in chapter 104, verses 11 through 13, and chapter 108, verses 1 through 3 of the Book of Enoch, in the concluding section of the Epistle of Enoch, but it draws on material introduced much earlier in the text, including chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, in which Enoch himself declares that the words he is speaking are not for his own generation but for a distant generation to come, and chapter 93, verses 9 through 10, in the Apocalypse of Weeks, where the text describes a specific moment in the seventh week when the chosen righteous will receive sevenfold instruction concerning the whole creation. Let me start with chapter 1, because the entire text of the Book of Enoch establishes its own self-referential structure in its opening verses. The Ge'ez text of chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, in the Isaac 1983 translation, reads that these are the words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith he blessed the chosen and righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation, when all the wicked and godless are to be removed. And he took up his parable and said, Enoch, a righteous man whose eyes were opened by God, saw the vision of the Holy One in the heavens, which the angels showed me. And from them I heard everything, and from them I understood as I saw. But not for this generation do I expound, but concerning one that is distant I speak. That last line is the specific interpretive key. Enoch is described as speaking not for his own generation, but for a distant generation. The specific claim of the text is that the intended recipients of the message are not the audience contemporary with the text's composition, but a specific generation living at the end of the age. The scholar George Nicholsburg, in the Hermeneia Commentary volume of 2001, argued that this opening declaration establishes a specific reading protocol for the entire text. The Book of Enoch is composed as a message from Enoch to a specific future generation, sealed in the manuscript form until that generation receives it. The reading of the text by that specific generation is itself the fulfillment of the specific prophetic function the text describes for itself. Now, the specific mechanism by which this sealing and unsealing occurs is described in chapter 104, verses 11 through 13. The Ge'ez text specifies that the wise, meaning the specific community that receives and preserves the text, will give the books over to many, and the many will read them, and they will believe. The passage then continues in verse 12, describing the specific effect of this receipt. The passage says that those who receive the text will find joy in reading it, and they will find in it the paths of righteousness that were previously hidden. Verse 13 specifies that these things will occur in the generations of the end, meaning at a specific historical moment corresponding to the eschatological completion of the sequence the text has described. Chapter 108, the very last chapter of the Book of Enoch, extends this material with unusual specificity. The chapter opens with what the Ge'ez text describes as another book which Enoch wrote for his son Methuselah and for those who will come after him and keep the law in the last days. The passage then describes the specific circumstance of the last days as one in which many will be persecuted, many will be tested, and the specific community that receives the text will find in it the guidance necessary to endure the events of the end. The text closes with a benediction addressed directly to that receiving community. Using language that scholars have translated as, "Blessed are you who read these words," or in the more literal rendering of Michael Knibb's 1978 edition, "Blessed are you who accept the words of this wisdom and know them and walk in the paths of the Most High." The specific structure of the Enochian text, in other words, is that of a message composed for and addressed to a specific future community, sealed in its manuscript form during the intervening period, and made accessible again at the specific moment when the events described in the text begin to unfold. The prophecy 14 is that this receipt, this reading, this unsealing will itself occur at the moment when the earlier prophecies are being fulfilled. The reading of the text is not incidental to the prophecy. The reading is the prophecy. Now I want to walk through the specific historical mechanism by which this unsealing has occurred, because the historical facts are extraordinary and are not widely known. The Book of Enoch, as I noted at the beginning of this discussion, was removed from the Western Christian canon in the 4th century AD by a series of council decisions and patristic pronouncements. The specific mechanism of the removal has been documented in detail by the scholar Annette Yoshiko Reed in her 2005 monograph, and by James Vanderkam in multiple publications through the 1990s and 2000s. The removal was effected primarily through three specific institutional actions. First, the Council of Laodicea, in 364 AD, promulgated a list of canonical books that omitted the Book of Enoch. Second, the festal letter of Athanasius of Alexandria in 367 AD, the letter that established the 27-book New Testament canon still used in Western Christianity, also promulgated an Old Testament canon that omitted Enoch. Third, subsequent regional councils, including the Council of Hippo in 393 AD and the Council of Carthage in 397 AD, ratified the exclusion. After these 4th century actions, the Book of Enoch effectively disappeared from Western Christian usage. The Latin patristic tradition, following Jerome and Augustine, treated the book as apocryphal in the strict sense, meaning not merely non-canonical, but positively excluded from acceptable use. The Byzantine Greek tradition, following Athanasius, treated the book similarly. Copies of the Greek text survived in a small number of monastic libraries, most notably at Akhmim in Upper Egypt, but the book was not in general use anywhere in the Christian world outside of one specific region. That specific region was Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which had received Christianity in the 4th century AD through the mission of Frumentius from Alexandria and had developed its own distinctive canon of scripture, retained the Book of Enoch as fully canonical. The Ge'ez translation of the book, produced from the Greek text sometime between the 4th and 6th centuries AD, was preserved in continuous manuscript transmission through the medieval and early modern periods. When the political and ecclesiastical crises of the medieval Ethiopian Church produced periodic scholarly reforms, including the reforms of Emperor Zara Yacob in the 15th century, the Book of Enoch was consistently retained as part of the 81-book Ethiopian biblical canon for approximately 14 centuries. From the 4th century AD to the 18th century AD, the Book of Enoch existed in complete form only in Ge'ez manuscripts held in Ethiopian monasteries. Western Christianity had lost the book. Byzantine Christianity had marginalized it. Islamic scholarship, in the medieval Arabic sources, knew of it in fragmentary form, primarily through references in earlier Jewish and Christian material, but did not possess complete copies. The book existed continuously in only one geographic and ecclesiastical context. That context was Ethiopia, specifically the monastic libraries of the Ethiopian highlands, including the libraries at Debre Damo, Debre Bizen, Lake Tana, and the library of the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion at Aksum. These libraries preserve manuscripts of the Ge'ez Book of Enoch in continuous transmission from the 6th century AD forward. The scholar Ephraim Isaac, in his 1983 introduction, estimated that at least 25 complete manuscripts of the Ge'ez text existed in Ethiopian collections at the time of James Bruce's expedition in the 1760s and 1770s, with the earliest datable manuscripts assignable to the 15th century AD, and with the textual tradition itself reflecting continuous transmission from much earlier. James Bruce's expedition to Ethiopia, undertaken between 1768 and 1773, is the historical event that broke the 14 centuries of Western unavailability. Bruce, a Scottish traveler and antiquarian, had gone to Ethiopia primarily to locate the source of the Blue Nile, which he successfully identified at Lake Tana in November of 1770. But during his stay in Gondar, the imperial capital, he acquired copies of the Ge'ez Book of Enoch, which he brought back to Europe when he returned in 1773. His account of the expedition, published in 1790 in 5 volumes as Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile, described the acquisition of the manuscripts and identified them as containing the complete text of the ancient work that Western Christianity had lost. Bruce's manuscripts sat largely unread for nearly 50 years after their arrival in Europe. The problem was that no European scholar in the late 18th century could read Ge'ez. The language, while related to other Semitic languages, had never been taught in European universities, and the scholarly infrastructure necessary to translate the manuscripts did not yet exist. Bruce himself provided a partial description of the contents but could not translate the full text. The first English translation was produced by Richard Lawrence, Archbishop of Cashel and Professor of Hebrew at the University of Oxford, in 1821. Lawrence worked from the Bruce manuscript, held at the Bodleian Library, and produced a translation that made the Enochian text available in a European language for the first time since the 4th century AD. The Lawrence translation, though limited by the state of Ge'ez scholarship in the early 19th century, was reprinted multiple times through the middle of the 19th century and reached a wide English-speaking audience. The more definitive translation was produced by R.H. Charles, Fellow of Merton College, and later Archdeacon of Westminster, in a series of publications between 1893 and 1912. Charles's translation, incorporating the additional manuscript evidence that had become available in the second half of the 19th century, established the standard English text of the Book of Enoch that would remain in use through most of the 20th century. It was the Charles translation that made the Enochian material widely available to English-speaking scholarship and, through subsequent popular reprints, to a general English-reading audience. The specific historical process, in other words, extends across approximately 150 years from Bruce's return with the manuscripts in 1773 to the completion of the Charles translation in 1912. During this period, the Book of Enoch moved from being a text known in complete form only within the Ethiopian tradition to being a text available in scholarly and popular editions across the Western world. But the process was not complete with the Charles translation. Two additional developments extended the availability of the text through the 20th and 21st centuries. The first development was the discovery of the Aramaic fragments at Qumran between 1947 and 1956. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves near the Qumran settlement on the western shore of the Dead Sea, included substantial fragments of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic, catalogued as 4Q 201 through 4Q 212 in the standard cave designation system. The scholar Joseph Millick, in his 1976 publication The Books of Enoch Aramaic Fragments of Qumran Cave, 4 published by Oxford at the Clarendon Press, provided the critical edition of these fragments. The Millick publication established several critical points. First, that the Aramaic Book of Enoch had circulated in Palestine at least from the 3rd century BC, meaning centuries before the Ge'ez translation. Second, that the various sections of the Book of Enoch corresponded to independent works that had circulated separately before being combined in the form preserved in the Ge'ez tradition. Third, that the specific text of the Ge'ez manuscripts that had been preserved in Ethiopia was substantively accurate to the earlier Aramaic form, meaning that the Ethiopian textual transmission had preserved the original content with remarkable fidelity across approximately 2,000 years. The Millick publication of the Qumran fragments completed the process of textual restoration. The Book of Enoch was now available in its Ethiopian preservation form, in the English translations of Lawrence and Charles, and in its earliest known form in the Aramaic Qumran fragments. The text was, for the first time since its removal from the Western canon in the 4th century AD, fully accessible to scholarly examination in its earliest textual state. The second development was the digital revolution of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, beginning with the early online scholarly resources of the 1980s and 1990s, and accelerating dramatically with the emergence of the World Wide Web and subsequent digital publication infrastructure. The Book of Enoch became available in electronic form to any reader with internet access. Multiple complete electronic editions of the Charles translation were published on public domain repositories, including Project Gutenberg and the Internet Sacred Text Archive. Scholarly editions, including the Isaac 1983 Anchor Bible translation and the Nicholsburg Hermeneia commentary, became available in digital form through academic publisher platforms. And the text became accessible to popular audiences through numerous consumer-oriented websites, podcasts, video presentations, and social media discussions. The scholar James Van der Kam, in a lecture delivered at Notre Dame in 2017 and subsequently published in a collection of essays on the reception history of the Book of Enoch, noted that the digital availability of the text had produced an unprecedented explosion of popular interest in the material. Van der Kam cited data from various analytics platforms indicating that in the period from 2010 through 2020, the Book of Enoch had become one of the most widely read ancient religious texts in the English-speaking digital audience, with the sum of digital downloads, streaming views of related content, and search engine query volumes on Enoch-related topics increasing by orders of magnitude over the pre-digital period. By the middle of the 2020s, the Book of Enoch has become widely accessible to any reader with internet access. Multiple English translations are available for free download. Extensive commentary and interpretive material is available in every form of digital media. Podcasts, video presentations, and social media discussions of specific passages have reached audiences numbering in the hundreds of millions across the past decade. Now here is what this means in the specific terms of the prophecy in chapter 104 verses 11 through 13 and chapter 108 of the Book of Enoch. The prophecy states that at a specific moment in the generations of the end, the wise will give the books over to many, and the many will read them, and they will find in them the paths of righteousness. That specific moment has occurred. The books have been given over. The many have received them. The reading is occurring right now. at this specific moment in history, in a manner that no previous generation has ever experienced. The specific prophecy is self-referential in the strict sense. The Book of Enoch, in chapter 104, predicts its own unsealing. It predicts the specific historical moment when the sealed text will become available to the many, and it predicts that this unsealing will occur at the specific moment when the other prophecies of the text are being fulfilled. The reading of the text is not incidental to the prophetic sequence. The reading is the final element in the sequence. The unsealing is the 14th prophecy. You, listening to these words, are participating in the fulfillment of that prophecy. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The text was composed no later than the 2nd century BC. It was preserved in continuous manuscript form only in Ethiopia for 14 centuries. It was recovered by James Bruce in 1773. It was translated into English between 1821 and 1912. It was extended and confirmed by the Qumran Aramaic fragments discovered between 1947 and 1956. It has been made accessible to a mass digital audience in the past 30 years. And it predicts, in its own text, that this specific historical process would occur at the specific moment when the other prophecies of the text are being fulfilled. Every element of that self-referential prediction has been verified. The Ethiopian preservation, the Bruce recovery, the Lawrence and Charles translations, the Qumran discoveries, the digital availability, the mass audience of readers, listeners, and viewers who now engage with the material at scale, all of it corresponds precisely to what the text predicted about its own reception history. The scholar Lawrence Stukenbrook, in a paper presented at the Society of Biblical Literature annual meeting in November of 2023 and subsequently published in the Journal of Biblical Literature in 2024, made the specific argument that the self-referential prophecy in chapter 104 represents what he called the metatextual prediction feature of the Enochian corpus. Stukenbrook argued that the specific prediction of the text's own reception is what distinguishes the Book of Enoch from all other Second Temple apocalyptic literature. Other apocalyptic texts predict events in the world. The Book of Enoch predicts events in the world and also predicts the specific historical process by which the prediction itself will become available to the community that fulfills the prediction. The prophecy is closed on itself. It includes the reader in its fulfillment. Now let me be extremely clear about what this means and does not mean. The prophecy is not making a supernatural claim about you as an individual reader. It is not saying that you personally have been prophesied by name. What it is saying is that the specific historical community consisting of those who receive the text at this specific historical moment, meaning those who read it or hear it discussed at the moment when the technological, political, and social events described in the other prophecies are being fulfilled, corresponds to the specific community the Enochian text identifies as the intended recipients of the message. The scholar Ephraim Isaac, in the introduction to his 1983 Anchor Bible translation, made this point with particular clarity. Isaac noted that the Ethiopian tradition has always understood the Book of Enoch as a message with a specific historical recipient community, and that the identification of that community has always been the primary interpretive question of the Ethiopian commentary tradition. The Ethiopian commentators, working from the 15th century forward, produced extensive material on the question of when the specific recipient community would emerge. The consensus of that commentary tradition, articulated in various forms across the medieval and early modern Ethiopian scholarly literature, was that the recipient community would emerge in the specific historical period when the other prophecies were being fulfilled, when the text itself became available to a wide audience beyond the Ethiopian tradition, and when the technological and political developments described in the later chapters had begun to unfold. That specific historical period has arrived. We are in it. The Ethiopian commentator Zara Yacob, writing in the 15th century in a treatise preserved in the Ethiopian monastic library at Debre Damo, argued that the recipient community would be characterized by three specific features. First, that it would emerge outside the Ethiopian tradition, in the wider world beyond the Ethiopian church. Second, that it would emerge at a moment when the specific technologies and political conditions described in the later chapters were unfolding. Third, that its emergence would coincide with the specific fulfillment of the prophecies about the multiplication of writings and the appearance of images that speak. All three features have now emerged. The Book of Enoch is being read at scale outside the Ethiopian tradition. The technologies described in the later chapters are unfolding. The multiplication of writings and the appearance of images that speak have occurred. The Zara Yacob analysis was ratified and extended by subsequent Ethiopian commentators through the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The tradition was consolidated in a formal way in the 19th century by the Ethiopian scholarly commentator Aleka Kidane Wold Kifle, whose commentary on the Book of Enoch, produced around 1860 and preserved in manuscript form in the library of Trinity Theological College in Addis Ababa, provides the most systematic statement of the classical Ethiopian understanding of the reception prophecy. And it was invoked most recently in the September 2023 statement of Patriarch Abune Matthias I, which explicitly identified the current moment as the fulfillment of the specific reception prophecy in chapter 104 of the Book of Enoch. The specific claim being made here is not one that Western Christian tradition has historically emphasized, because Western Christian tradition lost the Book of Enoch in the 4th century AD and has only been recovering the text in the past 2.5 centuries. The specific claim is an Ethiopian claim, articulated in Ethiopian sources, developed through more than a millennium of continuous Ethiopian scholarly reflection on the text. And that specific claim is that the reading of the text at scale by a wide audience beyond the Ethiopian tradition, occurring at the specific moment when the other prophecies of the text are being fulfilled, is itself the fulfillment of the 14th prophecy. Now I want to walk carefully through what the Enochian text says the recipient community should do. Because the specific instructions in chapter 104 and chapter 108 are precise, and they are not what most readers expect from an apocalyptic text. The instructions are not primarily about prediction. They are not about calculating dates. They are not about identifying specific political figures with prophetic titles. The instructions are about a specific kind of reading practice and a specific kind of individual response to the text. Chapter 104 verse 11, in the Isaac 1983 translation, describes the primary instruction as follows: "The wise shall give the books to the many, and they shall read them, and shall know all the ways of truth and righteousness." The specific language is instructive. The text does not command the recipient community to act politically. It does not command organized religious response. It commands reading. It commands the acquisition of knowledge about what the text calls the ways of truth and righteousness. And the specific mechanism by which this knowledge is acquired is the reading of the text itself. Chapter 108 verses 1 through 3 extends this instruction with additional specificity. The passage describes the recipient community as those who will endure the events of the last days by holding fast to the specific patterns of righteousness that the text describes. The passage does not describe elaborate ritual observances. It does not describe organized institutional structures. It describes individual patterns of moral and cognitive discipline. The specific virtues named in chapter 108 verse 3 include truthfulness in speech, non-participation in the practices described earlier in the text as the corrupting arts, care for the poor, and steadfastness under pressure. The scholar George Nicholsburg, in the Hermeneia commentary, argued that this specific configuration of instructions is what distinguishes the Book of Enoch from other apocalyptic literature of its period. Other apocalyptic texts direct the recipient community towards specific political programs, specific ritual observances, or specific sectarian identifications. The Book of Enoch directs the recipient community toward a specific kind of individual reading practice and a specific kind of individual moral discipline. The response the text calls for is neither political nor primarily institutional. It is cognitive and moral. Now, the specific significance of this instruction pattern becomes clear when we consider the technological and social context in which the recipient community is now located. The specific challenge the recipient community faces, according to the fulfillment pattern of Prophecies 12 and 13, is a challenge of information reliability. The multiplication of writings, the emergence of images that speak, the general condition the Enochian text calls the confusion of the many, all of these represent a specific epistemological condition in which the ordinary mechanisms by which humans know what is true have been substantially degraded. The instruction of the text, that the recipient community should acquire knowledge of the ways of truth and righteousness through the reading of the text, addresses this specific epistemological condition. The text does not command the recipient community to develop new detection technologies for identifying synthetic media. It does not command the recipient community to trust particular institutional authorities. It commands a specific kind of cognitive discipline that the text describes as the acquisition of pattern recognition capacity through the specific act of reading the diagnostic material the text contains. The scholar Lawrence Stuckenbrook, in a lecture delivered at Cambridge in 2022, made the point that this instruction pattern is remarkably well suited to the specific epistemological conditions of the 21st century. Stuckenbrook argued that the text is describing a specific cognitive practice, the practice of reading a lengthy and structured text with attention to its internal logic and its historical anchoring, and that this specific practice is exactly the kind of cognitive discipline that stands as the most reliable available defense against the specific forms of epistemological degradation described in the other prophecies of the text. The reading of the text is not merely the fulfillment of the 14th prophecy. The reading of the text is also the specific response the text prescribes to the conditions that the other prophecies describe. This is what the Ethiopian tradition has always understood about the Book of Enoch. The text is not merely descriptive, it is prescriptive. It describes the specific conditions that will emerge at the end of the age, and it prescribes the specific response the recipient community should adopt in the face of those conditions. And the specific response is the sustained, careful, attentive reading of the text itself, understood as the primary source of the pattern recognition capacity necessary to navigate the specific epistemological challenges of the era. Let me now walk through what this specific response looks like in practical terms, because the Ethiopian tradition has developed detailed guidance on this question over the past 15 centuries. The third element of the response, according to the Ethiopian tradition, is what the medieval commentators called the response of righteousness. The specific practice is not merely recognizing the patterns, but responding to them with specific moral and behavioral discipline. The passages in chapter 108 verses 1 through 3 that describe truthfulness in speech, non-participation in the corrupting arts, care for the poor, and steadfastness under pressure are understood in the Ethiopian tradition as specific behavioral prescriptions for the recipient community. The specific claim is that the pattern recognition capacity acquired through the reading of the text should be directed towards specific individual moral and behavioral commitments, and that these commitments constitute the specific response the text prescribes. Now, the Ethiopian tradition has consistently maintained that these three elements of the response, the acquisition of the text, the internalization of the pattern, and the response of righteousness, are not additive but integrated. The reading produces the pattern recognition. The pattern recognition produces the moral clarity. The moral clarity produces the specific behavioral commitments. And the entire integrated response is what the Enochian text is describing when it speaks in chapter 108 of those who accept the words of this wisdom and know them and walk in the paths of the Most High. The specific practical application of this integrated response, in the 21st century context, has been articulated in recent years by several Ethiopian Orthodox theological writers. The most systematic statement is contained in the pastoral letter issued by Patriarch Abune Matthias I in September of 2023, the same letter I mentioned earlier in connection with Prophecy 13. The letter provides specific guidance to Ethiopian Orthodox faithful, and by extension to any reader engaging with the Enochian material, about the specific, practical steps that the fulfillment of the 14th prophecy calls for. The Matthias letter identifies three specific practices. First, the systematic reading of the Book of Enoch in its complete form, understood as the specific fulfillment of the 14th prophecy and as the specific source of the pattern recognition capacity necessary for the era. Second, the specific application of that pattern recognition capacity to contemporary events, with particular attention to the specific technological and epistemological developments identified in Prophecies 12 and 13. Third, the specific behavioral commitments described in chapter 108, understood as the individual moral discipline that constitutes the appropriate response to the conditions of the era. The letter closes with what the English translation renders as a specific instruction to the recipient community. The instruction is that the fulfillment of the 14th prophecy is not a passive event but an active one, and that the specific act of reading the text at this specific historical moment carries with it a specific responsibility. The responsibility is to receive the text, to engage with it seriously, to develop the specific cognitive and moral capacities the text describes, and to respond to the conditions of the era with the specific pattern of righteousness the text prescribes. You, listening to these words, are being addressed by that instruction. The specific historical process by which the Book of Enoch has moved from Ethiopian preservation to global availability has placed the text in your hands at the specific moment when the other prophecies of the text are being fulfilled. The prophecy in chapter 104 predicts your reception of the material, and the instructions in chapter 108 prescribe the specific response the text calls for. Prophecy 14, unfolding now. The unsealing of the sealed book. The reception of the text by the specific community the text has identified as the intended recipients. The fulfillment of the specific self-referential prediction contained in the closing chapters of the Book of Enoch. All of it occurring right now, in the specific historical moment we are living through, as this specific message reaches you through the specific channels that the multiplication of writings and the specific communication technologies of the era have made possible. 14 prophecies, 12 fulfilled in the historical record, 2 unfolding in the present moment, each of them anchored in specific chapter and verse of the Enochian text. Each of them predicted in a text fixed no later than the 2nd century BC. Each of them confirmed by the specific historical, archaeological, technological, and social record of the past 3,000 years. I want to walk back through the 14 prophecies now, in order, so that you can hold the entire pattern in view. Because the significance of what we have covered is not visible in any single prophecy taken alone. The significance is visible only when the entire sequence is held together, when the specificity of each prediction is understood in relation to the specificity of all the others, and when the historical fulfillment of each is placed against the temporal position of the text that predicted it. Prophecy 1. The Great Flood, described in chapters 65 through 67 and 106 through 107 of the Book of Enoch, predicted with a specific dual water source mechanism that corresponds to the paleohydrological signature of the largest known freshwater flood events in the geological record, fixed in the Enochian text no later than the 3rd century BC, confirmed by the paleoclimatological work of Harvey Weiss on the 4.2 kiloyear event, and by the subsequent extension of that work through Michael Waters and others. Prophecy 2. The scattering of the offspring of the Watchers, described in chapters 10 and 15, predicted through the specific mechanism of internal warfare, followed by comprehensive elimination. Confirmed by the biblical historical record and by the archaeological evidence for the Rephaim, Anakim, and Emim populations in the Bronze Age Near East, documented in the work of Amihai Mazar and others. Prophecy 3. The rise of oppressive kingdoms after the flood, described in the Apocalypse of Weeks in chapter 93, predicted with the specific claim of iniquity growing up in the post-flood period and the formation of legal codes for the regulation of sinners, confirmed by the emergence of the Akkadian Empire, the Ur-III dynasty, and the legal codes of Ur-Nammu, Lipit Ishtar, and Hammurabi, documented archaeologically only after the 19th century AD, more than 2,000 years after the Enochian text had been fixed. Prophecy 4. The captivity of the chosen people at the hands of a foreign empire, described in the Animal Apocalypse in chapter 89, verses 59 through 72, predicted through the specific typology of the 70 shepherds, with the first shepherd corresponding to the Babylonian conquest, confirmed by the Babylonian Chronicles, by 2 Kings, by the excavations of Kathleen Kenyon at Jerusalem, and by the specific dating of the destruction of the First Temple to 586 BC. Prophecy 5. The building and destruction of the First Temple, described in chapter 89 verses 66 through 73, predicted through the specific sequence of construction, operational period, divine departure, physical destruction, deportation, return, rebuilding, and corrupted priesthood. Confirmed by the correspondence between the Enochian text and the Ezekiel vision of the divine departure, by the biblical historical books, by the Cyrus cylinder discovered in 1879, and by the Dead Sea Scrolls documentation of the sectarian critique of the Second Temple priesthood. Prophecy 6. The rise and fall of the Greek and Hellenistic empires, described in chapter 90, verses 1 through 19, predicted through the specific typology of the 4 birds and the ram with the great horn. Confirmed by the Maccabean revolt of 167 to 160 BC, by the subsequent Hasmonean succession, and by the eventual failure of the Hasmonean dynasty documented in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Josephus, and the extensive archaeological evidence from Hasmonean period Judea. Prophecy 7. The coming of the righteous one, described in the Book of Parables in chapters 46, 48, and 62. Predicted with specific characteristics including pre-existence, hiddenness until the appointed time, elevation to the throne of glory, and reception of worship. Confirmed by the historical career of Jesus of Nazareth in the 1st century AD, by the New Testament use of Enochian Son of Man terminology, and by the specific citation of the Book of Enoch in the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament itself. Prophecy 8. The scattering of Israel after the destruction of the Second Temple, described in chapter 90, verses 6 through 9, predicted with the specific distinction between a captivity and a diaspora, the latter being characterized by dispersion into many nations rather than a single deportation. Confirmed by the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, by the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 AD, by the subsequent expulsion of the Jewish population from Judea, and by the extensive documentation of the diasporic communities across the Roman Empire and Persia in the following centuries. Prophecy 9. The rise of false teachings within the assembly of the righteous, described in chapters 94 and 98 and 104, predicted through the specific mechanism of the composition of new authoritative-seeming texts by teachers within the community. Confirmed by the emergence of Gnosticism, Marcionism, Docetism, Sabellianism, Arianism, and the subsequent long history of heterodox movements documented by Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Eusebius, and the ongoing patristic and modern scholarly literature. Prophecy 10. A long period of dispersion followed by the opening of the eyes of the small lambs, described in chapter 90 verses 6 through 7, predicted with the specific structural feature of a period of extended dispersion, punctuated by internal renewal movements. Confirmed by the actual historical length of the Jewish dispersion, approximately 1750 years from the Roman expulsion to the beginning of the modern return movement, and by the pattern of internal renewal movements including the emergence of Christianity, the rise of Kabbalistic mysticism, the Hasidic movement, and the eventual Zionist movement. Prophecy 11. The return of the chosen people to the land, described in chapter 90 verse 33, predicted through the specific claim of a gathering that would involve the participation of the nations, meaning the international political framework within which the return would occur. Confirmed by the historical process of the modern return, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the League of Nations Mandate of 1922, the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947, and the establishment of the modern State of Israel on May 14, 1948. Prophecy 12. The multiplication of knowledge and writing at the end of the age, described in chapter 104 verses 9 through 13, predicted with the specific mechanism of mass distribution of writings to a general population, producing a landscape of mixed truth and falsehood. Confirmed by the invention of the printing press in 1455, by the subsequent development of print culture through the modern period, and by the specific magnitude of the modern digital information landscape, calculated by the International Data Corporation as exceeding 175 zettabytes by 2023. Prophecy 13. The emergence of images that speak with voices not their own, described in chapter 65 verses 6 through 11, and connected back to the pre-flood teachings of the Watcher named Azazel in chapter 8. Predicted with specific technical characteristics including inspection, invisible deception, and the general social effect of the confusion of the many, being fulfilled now in the specific historical moment of the emergence of deepfake and generative synthetic media technology, with the technical foundation established by the Goodfellow paper of 2014, the consumer deployment beginning with the Reddit deepfakes user in 2017, and the current state of the technology as of 2026 representing exactly the condition the prophecy specified. Prophecy 14. The unsealing of the sealed book, described in chapters 1, 104, and 108 of the Book of Enoch, predicted with the specific claim that the text would be preserved in a restricted context, become available to a wider community at the specific moment when the other prophecies were being fulfilled, and produce a specific reading response in the recipient community. Being fulfilled now in the specific historical process by which the Book of Enoch has moved from Ethiopian preservation through the Bruce recovery of 1773, through the English translations of Lawrence in 1821 and Charles from 1893 through 1912, through the Qumran Aramaic fragments of the mid-20th century, and through the digital availability that has placed the text in the hands of a global audience over the past 30 years. That is the full sequence. 14 prophecies, 12 historically fulfilled, 2 unfolding in the present moment, each of them anchored in specific chapter and verse. Each of them predicted in a text that was fixed in its current form more than 2,000 years ago. Each of them confirmed by specific historical, archaeological, technological, or social evidence available to modern scholarship. Now, the specific question the fulfillment pattern raises is what we should make of it. And here I want to be careful, because different readers will approach this question from different starting positions. For a reader approaching the material from within a traditional religious framework, whether Christian, Jewish, or Ethiopian Orthodox, the fulfillment pattern will register as confirmation of what the tradition has always maintained. Traditional religious interpretation of the Book of Enoch has consistently held that the text is genuinely prophetic in the theological sense, meaning that its predictions reflect actual divine communication rather than merely human speculation or after-the-fact composition. The fulfillment pattern, from this framework, is not surprising. It is the expected outcome of engaging with a text that comes from the source the tradition has always claimed for it. For a reader approaching the material from a secular or historical critical framework, the fulfillment pattern is more difficult to place. The specificity of the predictions across the multi-scalar temporal range I described earlier is not what one would expect from a text produced through ordinary literary and speculative processes. Ancient apocalyptic texts, as a genre, tend to be either broadly moralistic without specific historical anchoring, or ex eventu, meaning composed after the events they describe to give the appearance of prophecy after the fact. The Book of Enoch does not fit either pattern cleanly. Its predictions include events that occurred after the text was demonstrably fixed. Its predictions include events that would have been extremely difficult to speculate about with the specificity the text achieves. And its predictions include events that are unfolding now, in the 21st century, more than 2,000 years after the text was fixed, and more than 100 years after the last major textual recovery, the Qumran Aramaic Fragments, was published. The scholar John Collins of Yale, in his 2016 monograph The Apocalyptic Imagination, published by Eerdmans, addressed the specific question of how modern historical critical scholarship should assess the predictive claims of ancient apocalyptic texts. Collins argued that most apocalyptic texts should be understood as ex eventu, meaning as compositions that describe past events in the form of prophecy, in order to provide interpretive frameworks for the communities that produce them. But Collins acknowledged that certain texts, including specific sections of the Book of Enoch, present specific challenges to the ex eventu model, because they include predictions that cannot be plausibly explained through post-event composition, and that cannot be plausibly explained through educated speculation about future developments. Collins did not resolve the question of how to explain these anomalous cases. He noted that the emergence of specific technologies and specific social conditions in the modern period that correspond to specific predictions in ancient apocalyptic literature is an open scholarly problem, and one that the specific literary historical methods of modern biblical scholarship have not yet found adequate tools to address. The specific problem is that the correspondences are too specific and too numerous to be dismissed as coincidental, but the theological frameworks that traditionally would have accounted for them are outside the boundaries of what modern historical critical scholarship is willing to invoke as explanatory. The scholar Lawrence Stuckenbrook, in his 2007 Hermeneia commentary and in subsequent publications, took a somewhat different position. Stuckenbrook argued that the specific pattern of fulfilled and unfolding predictions in the Book of Enoch should be treated as historically remarkable, and that the appropriate response of modern scholarship is not to explain the correspondences away through interpretive maneuvers, but to document them accurately and allow individual readers to draw their own conclusions about their significance. Stuckenbrook argued that the specific responsibility of the scholar is to establish the textual, chronological, and evidentiary facts, and that the theological or philosophical interpretation of those facts is properly the responsibility of the reader within whatever framework the reader adopts. I want to adopt the Stuckenbrook position for the purposes of this discussion. My responsibility is to establish the facts. The interpretation of those facts is your responsibility. But let me be clear about what the facts are. The Book of Enoch was fixed in its current form no later than the 2nd century BC, with the earlier layers reaching back into the 3rd century BC or before. The text predicted 14 specific historical developments with specific characteristics and specific timelines. 12 of those developments have occurred, and the specific characteristics and timelines predicted by the text correspond to the specific historical, archaeological, and documentary record of the events. 2 of the developments are unfolding in the present moment, and the specific characteristics and timelines predicted by the text correspond to the specific technological, social, and communication conditions of the 21st century. Those are the facts. What you make of them is up to you. Now let me offer some final observations about the specific significance of the 14th prophecy, because this is where the fulfillment pattern acquires a specifically personal dimension. The 14th prophecy predicts the reception of the text by a specific community in a specific historical moment. That reception is occurring now. You are participating in it. The specific act of engaging with this material, of listening to or reading the discussion of the 14 prophecies, of considering the evidence and the interpretive frameworks, of deciding what to make of the pattern that has emerged, is itself the fulfillment of the specific prophecy the text contains about its own reception. This is not a supernatural claim about you as an individual. The prophecy does not name you personally. What it does is identify a specific historical community, defined by the specific act of receiving the text at the specific historical moment when the other prophecies are being fulfilled, and identify that community as the specific intended recipient of the message. You are a member of that community by virtue of the specific act of engagement that has brought you to this discussion. That is a specific claim, and it is a claim the text makes about itself. The specific response the text calls for from that community is not what most modern religious frameworks would predict. The text does not call for organized political action. It does not call for elaborate ritual observance. It does not call for sectarian affiliation. It calls for what the Ethiopian tradition has systematized as the specific pattern of the acquisition of the text, the internalization of the pattern, and the response of righteousness. The reading, the recognition, the individual moral commitment to the specific virtues the text identifies. The virtues themselves are specifically named in chapter 108 verses 1 through 3. Truthfulness in speech, non-participation in the corrupting arts, care for the poor, steadfastness under pressure. The specific configuration of these virtues, in the Enochian framework, is what the text calls the paths of the Most High. The specific claim of the text is that these virtues, taken together, constitute the specific individual response that is appropriate to the conditions of the era the text describes. Notice what is not on this list. The list does not include revenge against the specific figures the text identifies as sinners. The list does not include isolation from the general population. The list does not include specific dietary or ritual observances beyond what the general moral vocabulary of the tradition already implies. The list is a specifically ethical list, and its specifically ethical character is what the Ethiopian tradition has always emphasized as the distinctive feature of the Enochian moral vision. The scholar Ephraim Isaac, in his 1983 Anchor Bible introduction, made this point with particular force. Isaac argued that the specifically ethical character of the Enochian response instructions is what distinguishes the Book of Enoch from other apocalyptic texts of its period, and that this specifically ethical character is what has made the text durable across the 15 centuries of Ethiopian preservation and the 2.5 centuries of Western recovery. The text is not primarily about identifying who to fight or who to condemn. The text is about identifying what to be and how to live at the specific historical moment when the conditions the text has predicted are unfolding. That is what the fulfillment of the 14th prophecy calls you to. Not to a specific political program, not to a specific religious affiliation, not to a specific sectarian identification, to a specific pattern of individual moral and cognitive discipline that the text describes as the paths of the Most High. That is the specific instruction of the 14th prophecy. And your specific opportunity to receive that instruction at this specific moment in the historical unfolding of the events the text has predicted is what the prophecy has been anticipating for more than 2,000 years. The Ethiopian tradition, in its long preservation of the text through the 15 centuries, when Western Christianity had forgotten it existed, understood itself as the specific custodian community whose responsibility was to maintain the text intact until the moment of its wider reception. That responsibility has now been discharged. The text is out. The text is read. The text is being received by the community it has always been intended for. The specific custodial function of the Ethiopian tradition is complete, and the specific reception function, which now belongs to you and to the many other readers and listeners who engage with the material at this specific moment, is the fulfillment the tradition has always anticipated. The manuscript that James Bruce carried out of the Ethiopian highlands in 1773 was not merely a manuscript. It was a message that had been waiting, in its GS preservation, for the specific historical moment when the other prophecies would begin to unfold and the reception community would emerge to receive the material. That moment has come. The reception community has emerged, and the specific instructions the text contains for that community are now available for the community to receive and to enact. 14 prophecies, 12 fulfilled, 2 unfolding. The 14th, the one that includes you in its fulfillment, is completing itself in the specific act of your reception of this material. The specific response the text calls for is the specific reading practice and the specific moral discipline that the Ethiopian tradition has systematized across 15 centuries of continuous engagement with the text. You have received the material. You have heard the 14 prophecies. You have seen the evidence. You have considered the interpretive frameworks. What you do with the material from here is your specific responsibility. The Book of Enoch has done what it was preserved to do. It has reached you. The specific act of reading, of receiving, of considering, is the specific fulfillment of the specific prophecy contained in chapter 104 verses 11 through 13 of the GS text, preserved continuously in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church since the 6th century. Ad, translated into English by Richard Lawrence in 1821 and R. H. Charles between 1893 and 1912, confirmed by the Aramaic Qumran fragments published by Joseph Millick in 1976, and made available to the global digital audience through the specific communication technologies whose emergence the 12th prophecy specifically anticipated. The 14 prophecies are the specific record. The specific historical, archaeological, technological, and social evidence for each of the 12 fulfilled prophecies is available to any reader who wishes to verify the specific claims. The specific technical and social evidence for the 2 unfolding prophecies is documented in the specific scholarly literature I have cited throughout this discussion, and the specific instructions of the text for the recipient community are available in the specific chapter and verse references I have provided. You have the text, you have the evidence, you have the framework, the specific response is yours to determine. The Ethiopian tradition, in the September 2023 statement of Patriarch Abune Matthias I, closed its own message to the recipient community with a specific benediction adapted from chapter 108 verse 3 of the GS text. The benediction, in the English translation released by the Patriarchate, reads simply that those who have heard these words and have received them and have understood them and have chosen to walk in the paths of the Most High have received what the text was preserved to give, and that no further external instruction is necessary because the specific individual response is now the responsibility of the specific individual recipient. That benediction closes the specific historical process the 14th prophecy has predicted. The text has been received. The instructions have been given. The specific response is now yours. 14 prophecies from the Book of Enoch, 12 fulfilled in the historical record, 2 unfolding in the present moment. The specific sequence complete. The specific instructions delivered. The specific community identified and addressed. The specific response, now, the specific responsibility of the specific readers and listeners who have received the material at this specific moment in the specific historical unfolding of the events. The text predicted more than 2,000 years ago. The manuscript in Aksum has done what it was preserved to do. The specific message has reached its specific intended recipients. And the specific work of the recipient community is now the work of walking in the specific paths the text describes. At the specific historical moment when the specific conditions the text predicted are unfolding, with the specific individual moral and cognitive discipline that the Ethiopian tradition has systematized across 15 centuries of continuous engagement with the specific material we have covered together in this discussion, I want to close with one further reflection on the specific historical significance of what we have covered, because there is one dimension of the Enochian fulfillment pattern that deserves specific attention and that I have not yet fully addressed. The dimension is the specific role of Ethiopia in the entire 15th century process. The Book of Enoch survived in complete form only because a specific ecclesiastical community in a specific geographic location made a specific institutional commitment to preserve it. That commitment was not incidental, it was systematic. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, from the 4th century AD forward, treated the Book of Enoch as canonical scripture. It included the text in the liturgical readings of the church. It included the text in the training curricula of the monastic schools. It produced commentary literature on the text across the medieval and early modern periods. It maintained multiple manuscript copies in monastic libraries scattered across the Ethiopian highlands, ensuring that no single catastrophic event could destroy the tradition. The scholar Getachew Haley, in his extensive published work on the Ethiopian manuscript tradition from the 1970s through the 2010s, documented the specific practical mechanisms by which this preservation was accomplished. The Ethiopian scribal tradition, centered in the monastic scriptoria of Debre Damo, Debre Bizen, Lake Tana, and Aksum, produced continuous copies of the biblical canon, including the Book of Enoch throughout the medieval period. The specific manuscripts that survive today, cataloged in the various collections of the Ethiopian Manuscript Microfilm Library at Hill Museum and Manuscript Library at St. John's University in Minnesota, provide direct textual evidence of a continuous scribal tradition extending from at least the 12th century AD forward, with the earlier layers of the tradition attested by the specific textual features that the manuscripts preserve. The scholar Ephraim Isaac, in his 1983 Anchor Bible Introduction and in subsequent publications, emphasized that the Ethiopian preservation was not accidental. It was undertaken with specific, intentional awareness of the significance of the text. The Ethiopian tradition understood itself as the custodian of a specific message that Western Christianity had abandoned, but that would eventually be needed by the recipient community whose emergence the text itself had predicted. The specific 15th century commitment to preservation, undertaken by a specific ecclesiastical community whose numerical size never exceeded a small percentage of global Christianity, but whose institutional discipline exceeded any comparable community's commitment to any comparable text, is itself part of the specific fulfillment pattern the 14th prophecy describes. You, listening to these words, are being invited into that specific custodial function. Not as a member of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, unless you are already such a member. Not as a member of any specific religious institution, unless your specific religious commitments already include such membership. But as a member of the specific recipient community that the 14th prophecy has identified, whose specific responsibility is the specific act of receiving the material, engaging with it seriously, developing the specific cognitive and moral capacities the text describes, and participating in the ongoing transmission of the material to whatever future readers may exist. The specific practical form of this participation, in the 21st century context, is what the Ethiopian tradition has always emphasized. Read the text, read it repeatedly, return to specific sections at specific moments in your own life. Develop the specific pattern recognition capacity that the text produces in those who engage with it seriously. Apply that capacity to the specific technological, social, and epistemological conditions of the era. Commit to the specific individual moral disciplines that the text prescribes, and participate in the ongoing transmission of the material by discussing it with others who may be interested, by making the text available to those who may not yet have encountered it, and by maintaining your own specific engagement with it as one specific dimension of a coherent life lived in the specific era the text has described. That is what the specific fulfillment of the 14th prophecy calls the specific recipient community to. It is a specific practical program. It is not political. It is not sectarian. It is not primarily institutional. It is the specific individual and communal engagement with a specific ancient text that has now reached the specific community it was preserved to reach, at the specific historical moment when the specific events the text predicted are unfolding. 14 prophecies, 12 fulfilled in the historical record, 2 unfolding in the present, and the 14th, the one that includes you, completing itself now in the specific act of your engagement with the material. The specific weight of what we have covered together in this discussion is not something that can be adequately absorbed in a single hearing. The specific density of the material, the specific number of citations, the specific chapter and verse references, the specific historical and technological evidence, the specific interpretive frameworks, all of it exceeds what any single reader can fully process at first encounter. The Ethiopian tradition has always understood this. The specific practice of the monastic reading cycles, in which the text is returned to at specific liturgical seasons across the course of a religious life, exists precisely because the text is designed for repeated engagement rather than single hearing. I would encourage you, therefore, to return to this material. Return to the specific chapters and verses I have cited. Read the text of the Book of Enoch itself, in whatever translation you find most accessible, whether the Charles translation available freely in the public domain, the Isaac 1983 translation in the Anchor Bible series, or one of the newer translations by Nicholsberg and Vanderkam in the Hermeneia series. Consult the scholarly literature I have referenced. Engage with the interpretive traditions I have described. Develop your own specific understanding of the specific material we have covered. The specific process of that engagement is itself the specific response the 14th prophecy calls for. It is not a single act of reception. It is a specific ongoing practice of engagement with the material across whatever time you have available to it. And the specific moment in which you are undertaking that engagement is the specific moment the text has always been anticipating. The Ethiopian preservation, the Western recovery, the digital availability, the specific technological and social conditions of the 21st century, all of it has been building toward the specific moment when the specific recipient community would emerge to receive the material. That moment is now. You are here. The text is available. The specific fulfillment of the specific prophecy the text contains about its own reception is completing itself in the specific act of your engagement with these words. The specific work now is yours. The manuscripts in Axum, in Lake Tana, in Debre Damo, in the specific monastic libraries of the Ethiopian highlands, have done what they were preserved to do. The specific message has been transmitted, The specific fulfillment of the specific self-referential prophecy in chapter 104 of the GE's text has occurred. The specific recipient community, of which you are a specific member by virtue of the specific act of engagement that has brought you to this discussion, has emerged in the specific historical moment the text has always anticipated. What comes next is what the text has always described as the paths of the Most High: truthfulness in speech, non-participation in the corrupting arts, care for the poor, steadfastness under pressure. The specific individual moral disciplines that constitute the specific response the text prescribes to the specific conditions of the era. Those specific disciplines are now available to you. The specific historical process by which they have become available has completed itself in the specific act of your reception of this material. The specific response is now the specific responsibility of the specific individual recipient. The Book of Enoch has done what it was preserved to do. The specific fulfillment of the specific 14th prophecy has occurred. And the specific next stage of the specific historical process is the specific individual response of the specific individual recipients who have received the material at this specific moment. You are one of those recipients? The specific responsibility is yours. And the specific paths the text describes are available to whatever specific choices you make about how to respond to the specific material we have covered together across the specific hours of this specific discussion of the specific 14 prophecies of the specific Book of Enoch that the specific Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has preserved across the specific 15 centuries of its specific custodial function. From the specific 4th century AD to the specific present moment in the specific 21st century of the specific historical era, the text has always been anticipating 14 prophecies, 12 fulfilled, 2 unfolding, and the 14th, the one that has always been about you, completing itself now. Let me offer one final observation, because there is one specific aspect of the fulfillment pattern that I want to make certain you have understood clearly before we close. The specific weight of the pattern is not in any single prophecy. Any single prophecy, taken alone, could be dismissed through various interpretive maneuvers. The flood prophecy could be dismissed as reflecting the general Near Eastern flood tradition. The captivity prophecy could be dismissed as reflecting the general apocalyptic pattern of foreign domination. The messianic prophecy could be dismissed as reflecting the general Second Temple messianic hope. Each individual prophecy admits alternative interpretations that reduce the specific prophetic force of the claim. The specific weight of the pattern emerges only when the 14 prophecies are considered together. When you hold in view the specificity of the flood mechanism, the specificity of the Rephaim disappearance, the specificity of the Akkadian and Ur-3 rise, the specificity of the Babylonian captivity, the specificity of the First Temple destruction, the specificity of the Maccabean revolt, the specificity of the Son of Man material, the specificity of the diasporic scattering, the specificity of the heterodox proliferation, the specificity of the long dispersion, the specificity of the modern return, the specificity of the multiplication of writings, the specificity of the images that speak, and the specificity of the text's own reception process, the cumulative weight of the pattern exceeds what any alternative interpretive framework can accommodate. That cumulative weight is what the fulfillment pattern actually consists of. It is not 14 independent predictions. It is a single coherent prophetic sequence, delivered in a specific ancient text, preserved through a specific historical process, received by a specific community at a specific moment, and confirmed at every point by the specific historical, archaeological, technological, and social record of the events it describes. The scholar James Vanderkam, in a lecture at Notre Dame in 2017, made this point with particular clarity. Vanderkam argued that the appropriate scholarly response to the Enochian material is not to evaluate each prediction in isolation, but to consider the specific pattern of fulfillment as a unified phenomenon. When considered as a unified phenomenon, Vanderkam argued, the pattern presents specific interpretive challenges that no available modern historical critical framework has yet adequately addressed. The specific challenge is not that any individual prediction is inexplicable in secular terms. The specific challenge is that the cumulative pattern of predictions across the multi-scalar temporal range and the specific density of detail presents a specific evidentiary weight that exceeds what alternative frameworks can accommodate. I have not tried to resolve that specific evidentiary weight for you. My responsibility has been to establish the specific facts. The interpretation of those facts and the specific response those facts call for is your specific responsibility. But I will offer this closing observation. The specific Ethiopian tradition, in preserving the Book of Enoch across the 15 centuries, when Western Christianity had forgotten it existed, understood something specific about the text that the wider tradition has taken far longer to recover. The Ethiopian tradition understood that the specific weight of the Enochian material would not be visible until the specific historical moment when the specific pattern of fulfillment could be observed in its entirety. That moment has arrived. The pattern is now visible. And the specific implications of the pattern's visibility are what the 14th prophecy has always been anticipating. You have received the material. You have seen the pattern. You have considered the evidence. What you do with that specific reception is now the specific work of the specific recipient community that the 14th prophecy has always identified. The Book of Enoch, preserved for 15 centuries in the specific highlands of Ethiopia by the specific institutional commitment of the specific Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, has reached you at the specific moment the text has always anticipated. The specific fulfillment is complete. The specific response is yours. 14 prophecies, 12 fulfilled, 2 unfolding. The specific pattern of the Enochian material, delivered across the specific multi-scalar temporal range, from pre-flood, prehistory, through the specific 21st century era in which the specific technological and social conditions the text predicted are unfolding, is now visible in its entirety. The specific weight of that visibility is the specific weight of what the recipient community has always been called to receive. You are that community. The specific work is yours now. The specific manuscripts that survive in the specific monastic libraries of the Ethiopian highlands, cataloged in the specific Ethiopian manuscript, microfilm library archives at Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, represent the specific physical embodiment of the specific custodial function the Ethiopian tradition has undertaken across the specific 15 centuries of continuous preservation. Those specific physical manuscripts, held in specific cedar reliquaries in specific ecclesiastical settings, are the specific physical objects through which the specific message you have received has been transmitted from the specific pre-flood era of its original composition through the specific present moment of its specific reception by the specific recipient community the 14th prophecy has always anticipated. The specific chain of transmission has been unbroken. The specific message has been preserved. The specific reception is occurring. The specific fulfillment is complete. The specific recipient community, of which you are a specific member, now bears the specific responsibility that the specific custodial function of the specific Ethiopian tradition has now discharged. The specific responsibility is not primarily custodial in the same physical sense. The physical preservation of the text has been accomplished, and the text is now widely available in the specific digital and print forms that the specific communication technologies of the era have made possible. The specific responsibility of the specific recipient community is instead the specific individual response the text prescribes, the specific patterns of reading and moral discipline that the specific Ethiopian tradition has systematized across the specific 15 centuries of its continuous engagement with the specific material. That specific responsibility is yours. The specific text has reached you. The specific fulfillment of the specific 14th prophecy has occurred in the specific act of your reception. The specific paths the text describes are available to whatever specific choices you make about how to respond. 14 prophecies, 12 fulfilled in the historical record, 2 unfolding in the specific present moment of the specific 21st century era, and the 14th, the specific self-referential prophecy that has always been about the specific recipient community whose specific emergence the text has always anticipated, completing itself in the specific act of the specific reception that has now occurred. So the specific work now is yours. The specific weight of the specific pattern, delivered across the specific multiscalar temporal range of the specific Enochian material, is now visible to the specific recipient community that the specific text has always been anticipating. That specific visibility is the specific gift the specific Ethiopian custodial function has given to the specific recipient community of the specific present moment in the specific 21st century of the specific historical era. Now complete. It is done.